Bye-bye, Death Eaters. Let's start with the least cozy living room in the wizarding world. Lucius Malfoy is sitting in his own drawing room, and he's scared to touch anything. The chandelier is still cracked from the night it came crashing down. The carpet is burned where Harry and Ron dueled for their lives. The grand, pure blood, peacock feather nightmare of Malfoy Manor has been downgraded to crime scene with better curtains. On the table in front of him? A wand. Not his. His is gone, snapped, humiliated, used by the boy he tried to destroy. This one belongs to some overworked ministry official who dropped it for a second and didn't even bother to pick it up again. Because Lucius Malfoy, former power broker, former Voldemort group chat moderator, is officially not worth the effort. The house is silent. No masked visitors apparating into the foyer. No Dark Lord pacing in front of the fireplace. No terrified elves skittering around trying not to get cursed. Just Lucius, Narcissa, and Draco sitting in separate corners of the same room like three ghosts who all regret the same party. Outside, owls keep thudding against the window with copies of the Daily Prophet. The headline is screaming. War trials begin. Death Eaters face justice. Underneath, moving photographs of shackled figures being led into the ministry. Dolohov, Rowell, Yaxley. Names that once made people flinch are now just tomorrow's court schedule. And Lucius, nobody's knocking. Nobody's inviting him to testify, to bargain, to slither his way into another I was Imperiist the whole time performance. The new ministry under Kingsley Shacklebolt has his file, has his history, and has exactly zero interest in giving him a platform. Look, nobody was surprised. This is the part the books fade out on. Voldemort's body hits the floor, the sun comes up, and we cut to 19 years later with everybody's kids on platform 9 3/4. But if you're wondering what happened in between, to all the people who spent years carving snakes into their arms and terrorizing literally everyone, yeah, take a moment. Some of them ended up in chains in Azkaban, without Dementors this time, which, if you've been paying attention, is its own kind of poetic downgrade. Some of them bolted into hiding, clinging to dark magic, vault gold, and very fragile egos. And some of them? They're back at their breakfast tables, pretending they were just concerned citizens who maybe accidentally supported magical fascism for a decade. Couldn't have happened to a nicer group. In this video, we're breaking down 24 major post-war events you probably never saw on screen. We're talking canon interviews, Rowling confirmations, and those tiny throwaway lines that quietly decide who rots in prison and who sends their kid back to Hogwarts like it's all fine now. We'll get to Umbridge's trial, the Caro's very bad performance reviews, Dolohov and Yaxley's return trip to Azkaban, what actually happened to the Malfoys, and even how the ministry itself tried to clean up its mess. For now, let's celebrate this. The Death Eaters lost. But their stories? They're just getting interesting. The Death Eaters lost. But the morning after? It did not feel like victory. Let's start with the sunrise that nobody appreciated. Dawn over Hogwarts was gray and smoky, dragging light over broken towers, shattered windows, and stone that looked like a giant had tried to eat the castle and given up halfway. Parts of the courtyard were still smoldering. The Great Hall was a mashup of hospital wing, morgue, and very awkward family reunion. People were stepping over rubble, over bodies, over bits of armor and fallen suits of armor. Outside, the air was thick with spellburn and ash. Stunned survivors wandered around in ripped dress robes, clutching wands and each other like they were afraid reality might disapparate. House elves picked through debris. Centaurs lingered at the forest's edge, and into all of that walked the ministry. If you're wondering how organized they were, they weren't. Shell-shocked aurors and officials apparated in, looking like they'd just realized their boss was a snake man with no nose, and they'd backed the wrong performance review. They had clipboards, quills, and absolutely no idea where to start. Who's dead? Who's missing? Who's under a pile of stones? And, crucially, who's still wearing a skull mask? Because Voldemort was gone, but his network wasn't. You didn't just delete a terror organization like an email. Across Britain, you still had snatchers lying low with stolen wands, Death Eaters who disapparated the second the tide turned, rich sympathizers sitting in their manors pretending they'd been under-imperious the whole time, and terrified collaborators who had very suddenly remembered their moral compass. The war was technically over. The manhunt was just beginning. Into that chaos stepped Kingsley Shacklebolt. Calm voice, purple robes, walking through the ruins like the only adult at a very cursed school trip. By the end of that day, he's interim minister for magic. Because look, nobody was surprised the old regime didn't survive the night. Kingsley's first priority isn't speeches. It's lists. Known Death Eaters. Known Snatchers. Known ministry loyalists who were a little too enthusiastic about arresting Muggle-born kids. He starts pulling aurors together, right there among the broken benches and floating candles, and turns Hogwarts into a temporary command center. Identify bodies. Secure wands. Separate fighters from prisoners. Get the wounded to St. Mungo's. Stabilize a population that just watched their government collapse twice in 1 year. And this is where our mission kicks in. We're not rehashing every spell in the Battle of Hogwarts. You've seen the movies. You've read Harry shout Protego like it's the only charm he knows. What we're doing is zooming in on what comes next. The 24 major post-war events, trials, reforms, and character fates that almost never make it into the highlight reel. Some of the people limping through that great hall are going to Azkaban. Some are about to cut deals that will haunt the wizarding world for decades. One very pink nightmare is heading toward a downfall that, honestly, couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. And the Malfoys? Yeah, take a moment, because their morning after is where things get really complicated. Event number 1. The Great Roundup. The war ends at breakfast. The manhunt starts before lunch. While Hogwarts is still smoking and the Great Hall tables are literally covered in bandages and pumpkin juice, Kingsley Shacklebolt is already doing what the last ministry never managed, actually organizing a response that isn't panic and write memos. Let's start with the squads. Kingsley throws together rapid response teams made of aurors, surviving Order of the Phoenix members, and the kind of hit wizards you only wheel out when things are really bad. These are the people who fought on the front lines a few hours ago, and now they're being handed folders with names like Dolohov, Antonin, still at large, please arrest immediately. No recovery period. No nap. Just, congratulations, you won the war. Go clean up what's left. If you're wondering how serious the new ministry is, look at what happens to Dolohov and Thorfinn Rowlem. These two had already slipped through the cracks once, escaped Azkaban during the mass breakout, and spent Deathly Hallows throwing unforgivable curses around like confetti. After the battle, they are explicitly hunted down, recaptured, and shipped straight back to Azkaban. No more donations to the right people, or my father will hear about this energy. The message is clear. Repeat offenders are going away for a very long time. And that old classic defense? I was under the Imperious curse. Yeah, take a moment. Because after the Second War, nobody is buying that like they used to. The first time around, Half the Wizengamot apparently decided that every rich pureblood in a mask was just tragically mind-controlled for 7 years, which, if you've been paying attention, was incredibly convenient for people like Lucius Malfoy. Now, when the same names show up with the same excuse, the Aurors are looking at them like, "Funny, the Imperius made you donate to Voldemort, torture muggles, and brag about it at parties." The big fish get headlines, but the net drags up a lot of smaller predators too. Snatchers, bounty hunters, and random opportunists who spent the last year dragging terrified kids out of hedgerows suddenly try to melt back into normal life. One day, they're swaggering around in stolen uniforms. The next, they're just humble shop assistants who definitely weren't shaking down Muggleborns last week. For now, let's celebrate that plenty of them are actually recognized, arrested, and marched off to trials they never thought they'd face. But not everyone gets caught in town. Some Death Eaters and Snatchers bolt for the fringes of wizarding society, disappearing into half-abandoned manors, cursed forests, and those weird villages where everyone pretends not to see dark marks. The countryside basically turns into an unhinged scavenger hunt for dark wizards, with Auror teams apparating from farm to farm, pulling up floorboards, and stunning people who thought a glamour charm and a fake name would be enough. And still. When the dust starts to settle and the first arrest logs are published, the wizarding world notices something chilling. A lot of names are crossed off, but a few high-profile Death Eaters are missing completely. No body, no capture, just blank space. And everyone knows blank space in a war like this never stays empty for long. That blank space? Kingsley Shacklebolt walks straight into it. Let's start with the glow-up. 1 minute, he's the calm guy in the Order who casually bodyguards the Muggle Prime Minister. The next, he's interim Minister for Magic, standing in the ruins of Hogwarts, wand still warm from dueling Death Eaters. Unlike, say, Cornelius PR Disaster Fudge, Kingsley actually fought Voldemort. People saw him on the front lines. That gives him this rare, moral authority that no stack of ministry pamphlets could ever fake. And Kingsley uses it. Fast. His first move is basically, no more oops Dark Lord government. He starts purging corrupt officials, the ones who signed those Muggle-born registration commission forms, like they were ordering lunch. Every department head gets reviewed. Every senior official who collaborated with the Death Eater-controlled ministry is investigated. If you're wondering, yes, that includes people who just followed orders, and people who didn't ask questions. The wizarding world had just watched that excuse burn down in real time. The trials are messy. They have to untangle who was imperious, who was terrified, and who was enthusiastically evil. But Kingsley's ministry actually tries. They collect memories, drag out pensives, cross-check witness statements, and stop letting rich purebloods buy their way out with a donation and a sad story. Look, nobody was surprised that some old families tried exactly that. The surprise was that, for once, it didn't always work. Then comes Azkaban, the big one. For centuries, the wizarding solution to crime was, ship you to a rock in the ocean and let Dementors eat your personality. Apparently, nobody wrote a memo about how that might backfire. After the Dementors happily teamed up with Voldemort for unlimited snack time, Kingsley looks at the whole setup and says, absolutely not. Dementors are removed as guards. All of them. Gone. Human staff and layered magical security replace them. Wards, charms, physical patrols, the works. It's still Azkaban. It's still terrifying, and the waves are still crashing dramatically against the walls, but the prison is no longer powered by institutionalized supernatural misery. Yeah, take a moment. For Death Eaters, that shift is huge. proven killers and torturers, like Dolohov and Raoul, end up right back in Azkaban with long, brutal sentences. No one is handing out hugs and second chances to the people who murdered the Prewett brothers and crashed the Battle of Hogwarts like it was a festival. But the punishment isn't literally soul-sucking anymore. You're locked up, not slowly dissolved from the inside. Of course, even with reforms, old habits die hard. Some pure-blood families still have vaults full of gold, buried influence, and very good lawyers. Some manage house arrest and fines instead of a lifetime staring at gray stone, which, if you've been paying attention, is going to matter a lot for one disgraced blonde heir and his parents. For now, let's celebrate that the Ministry finally stopped hiring depression ghosts as security guards. But the question of who actually escapes the worst consequences, we'll get to that later. Event number 3. Trials 2.0. The imperious excuse is on thin ice. So, the Ministry has fired the depression ghosts and upgraded the locks. Cool. But what happens when you drag a bunch of masked war criminals into court and they all start screaming the same thing they did last time? I was imperious. Yeah, take a moment. We're doing the sequel nobody asked for, Imperious Excuse, Part 2. Let's start with the comparison. After the First War, the wizarding world was shell-shocked, terrified, and honestly kind of lazy about paperwork. A lot of rich, well-connected Death Eaters walked by saying, "Voldemort made me do it." And the Ministry, desperate to move on, basically stamped their forms and went, "Sure, why not?" Lucius Malfoy literally bought his way back into polite society with bribes and a sad story about being bewitched. This time, different planet. Kingsley's Ministry has decades of hindsight, a stack of war memorials, and absolutely no patience for recycled excuses. The Auror office is full of people who personally watched these guys duel teenagers at Hogwarts. Harry, Ron, and Hermione are giving testimony. McGonagall is giving testimony. The entire Battle of Hogwarts is one long, very loud eyewitness account. And the evidence game has leveled up. You've got pensive memories from the battle, from the Muggle-born Registration Commission, from raids and snatcher camps. You've got dark marks that don't just vanish when Voldemort dies. They sit there on people's arms like a cursed name tag. You've got Ministry records from the puppet government, showing who signed which arrest orders, who staffed Azkaban transfers, who was just following orders while casually ruining lives. If you're wondering whether anybody still gets away with, "I never wanted to be here," while their signature is on half the blood status decrees, we'll get to that later. But the short version is, the bar for imperious victim is now sky high. The messy part is, some people really were coerced. Some had their families threatened, their children targeted, or were hit with actual imperious and then left in that awful gray area where you can feel yourself doing things you don't want to do. Those trials are brutal. You've got people who hid Muggle-borns in their basements while also stamping Ministry forms. Victim and collaborator in the same body. The Wizengamot has to decide, is this someone you lock up forever, or someone you watch very closely and try to pull back into the light? Repeat offenders, though. Different story. Antonin Dolohov, who has been murdering people since the First War. Thorfinn Rowell, who helped torture kids during the Hogwarts occupation. Corbin Yaxley, the charming soul who imperioused Pius Thicknessa and helped turn the Ministry into Voldemort HQ. These guys show up in court with decades of bodies, raids, and torture behind them. Nobody is buying, "Oops, cursed again." Look, nobody was surprised when they ended up right back in Azkaban, this time without Dementors, but with actual security that doesn't defect to the first dark wizard offering snacks. And hanging over all of this is one more name. Not a masked duelist, but a pink cardiganed bureaucratic nightmare who once weaponized the legal system for fun. Because when Dolores Jane Umbridge finally shuffles into a courtroom and tries to play the same just following orders game she used to enforce, let's just say the wizarding world has receipts, and her trial makes even hardened Death Eaters nervous about what comes next. Umbridge's trial is raging. Everyone's arguing about laws and precedent, and who signed what decree. And then the Wizengamot does a hard pivot, because at some point, somebody says the quiet part out loud. We keep talking about Death Eaters, but what about the castle where they turned education into a war crime? Yeah, take a moment. Suddenly, Hogwarts isn't just the beloved school. It's a crime scene, a political symbol, a giant stone exhibit of what happens when you hand a boarding school to fascists and say, "Run the curriculum," instead of asking, which Death Eaters are guilty? The question becomes, what exactly did they do to our kids up there? Let's start with the Snape and Caro era. The Ministry drags out every record they can find. Timetables, exam papers, punishment logs, even those creepy Muggle studies essays where students were forced to write propaganda about Muggles being animals. If you're wondering, yes, those end up as evidence. Apparently, writing "mudbloods deserve what they get" under threat of torture doesn't look great in a courtroom. Witness after witness describes how the curriculum mutates. Defense against the dark arts becomes straight-up dark arts. No more defense, just here's how to crucio someone and try not to enjoy it too much. Muggle studies turns into a hate speech seminar. Detention stops being lines and becomes open-season blood sport in the dungeons, with Amicus Caro treating Cruciatus like a teaching aid. Students testify that they were used as forced labor, repairing damage from Death Eater raids, digging through rubble, even being marched around the grounds at night as human shields. Younger kids are threatened into becoming informants, told to report on blood traitors and Potter sympathizers, or watch their friends suffer. It's not school. It's a hostage situation with homework. And sitting right in the middle of all of this? Severus Snape, the headmaster who signed the timetables, sat in the big chair and apparently let it all happen. At first, his file is one of the ugliest on the table. Then the memories arrive. Once Harry hands over Snape's true story, the entire case flips. The Do Patronus, the unbreakable vow, the fact that he was secretly protecting students, sabotaging the Caros, and passing information to the Order the whole time. The worst moments of his headmastership get reinterpreted as damage control. He wasn't endorsing the regime. He was containing it while waiting to die on Dumbledore's schedule. Look, nobody was surprised that the public still argued about him. But officially, his name is cleared. Kingsley's ministry recognizes him as a double agent, a war hero, and yes, a legitimate headmaster. When his portrait finally goes up in the office, it's not a consolation prize. It's the state admitting they misread the Man in Black. The Caros don't get that kind of rewrite. We'll get to that later, but just know their Hogwarts stint becomes Exhibit A in their trials. Students line up to describe curses in corridors, electrocuted first years, and detentions that sound like rejected saw plots. The sadistic siblings who turned discipline into horror fuel? They're next on the list. And after the wizarding world finishes putting Hogwarts itself on the stand, it's ready to deal with the monsters who treated your childhood safe haven like a playground for pain. Bye-bye, Caros. Let's start with the best news first. The two people who somehow made Umbridge's detention style look like a mildly unpleasant study hall. They do not walk away from this war. If you're wondering who exactly we're roasting here, quick recap. Alecto and Amicus Carrow are Voldemort's hand-picked enforcers at Hogwarts, the budget Bellatrix siblings who apparently read school governance as state-sponsored torture. Alecto takes over Muggle studies and turns it into pure-blood propaganda hour. Amicus teaches dark arts by making kids practice Cruciatus, and together they run detention like an unhinged scavenger hunt for new emotional scars. These are the adults in charge. Yeah, take a moment. Their fall starts the night everything changes. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Alecto tries to spring a trap in Ravenclaw Tower, hits the Dark Mark alarm, and gets instantly stunned by Harry before she can brag about it. Zero fanfare, zero dignity, just lights out on the spot. Amicus storms in after, all spit and rage, and makes the mistake of grabbing McGonagall and spitting in her face. Look, nobody was surprised what happened next. Minerva casually drops him with a body bind, then has Harry and Luna help strap him up like a badly wrapped Christmas present. Because they're already unconscious and magically trussed up before Voldemort even reaches the castle, the Carrows end up being some of the easiest Death Eaters to capture in the entire cleanup. No daring chase, no dramatic duel, just Aurors and Order members doing a quick sweep after the dust settles and finding two of Hogwarts' worst educators stacked in a corridor like discarded furniture. Couldn't have happened to a nicer pair. Then come the trials, and this time the Ministry actually listens to the kids. Under Kingsley's watch, student witnesses pack the courtroom. Neville talks about being used as a human punching bag, about detentions where he comes back bleeding and barely able to stand. Ginny describes the unforgivables thrown around like chalk, Crucio used as classroom management when someone dares to talk back. Others describe being forced to curse classmates, to carve up first years, to watch as non-compliance meant torture. It's not subtle. It's not defensible. And because the new Ministry is done letting people shout "Imperious" and go home, the Carrows' usual excuses don't land. Sentencing is brutal, even without Dementors. Kingsley keeps Azkaban, but the soul-sucking guards are gone, replaced with actual human security and wards that don't eat your happiness for breakfast. Alecto and Amicus are shipped off for long-term imprisonment, names permanently stamped on the "Do Not Ever Hire as Staff" list of wizarding history. They end up as some of the most reviled teachers to ever walk Hogwarts' halls, which, if you've been paying attention, is a seriously competitive field. And the irony? Perfect. The professors who forced children to practice dark magic literally become the textbook example of why dark magic is banned. Future defense against the dark arts lessons. Point to the Carrows as the cautionary tale. What happens when cruelty runs a classroom? For now, let's celebrate that Hogwarts' worst substitute teachers are locked away, before we talk about the Death Eaters who didn't get caught so easily. From classroom tyrants to corporate evil. If the Carrows were the unhinged substitute teachers of Voldemort's regime, Corbin Yaxley was the guy quietly rewriting the syllabus for the entire Ministry. Different flavor of nightmare, same dark mark. Let's start with who this man actually was. Yaxley isn't just some random mask in the background. He's the Death Eater who helps topple Scrimgeour's ministry, walks into the atrium like he owns the place, and ends up head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement under Voldemort's puppet government. While the Carrows tortured kids, Yaxley weaponized parchment. He's the one enforcing Muggle-born registration, signing arrest orders, and turning the justice system into a pure-blood attack dog. Bureaucratic evil with a quill and very bad priorities. If you're wondering when we last saw him on page, it's that Ministry heist in Deathly Hallows. Hermione's disguised as Mafalda Hopkirk. They're trapped under that cursed rain cloud in his office, and Yaxley literally drags her through it, trying to keep her from escaping. That moment matters. Because when they all disapparate out of the ministry, he grabs onto Hermione and gets yanked to Grimmauld Place with them, accidentally breaking its Fidelius protections. Yeah? Take a moment. Thanks to Yaxley, Voldemort finds Sirius's old house, and the trio lose their safe base. Then he escapes right back into Voldemort's inner circle, one of the trusted lieutenants who helped keep the regime running until the very end. After the Battle of Hogwarts, that resume becomes a problem. Unlike the rank-and-file snatchers who could mumble something about being desperate, Yaxley has a very public paper trail. His name is on decrees, trials, and the entire Muggle-born persecution machine. Under Kingsley Shacklebolt's new ministry, with its whole "we're actually going to do justice now" vibe, Yaxley jumps straight to the top of the priority arrest list. Look, nobody was surprised. This is the guy who literally ran magical law enforcement for Voldemort. You don't get to pretend you were Imperiist into holding staff meetings. So what happens to him? He's captured in the post-war cleanup, dragged into a real trial this time, and, unlike Lucius Malfoy, he has 0 last-minute redemption points. No saving Harry. No turning on Voldemort. No distressed family narrative. Just years of being the Dark Lord's HR manager for oppression. Under the reformed Azkaban system, with Dementors fired and actual human security in place, Yaxley ends up exactly where he belongs, serving a long, probably life, sentence. The important thing is what that sentence means. For once, the wizarding world treats signing evil policies as seriously as casting the Cruciatus curse. Pushing quills that ruin lives finally counts as real violence. For now, let's celebrate that people like Yaxley don't get to hide behind, "I was just doing my job." But here's the uncomfortable part. Not every Death Eater gets the full Azkaban experience. Some, especially the rich and well-connected, manage to slither into a very fancy, very awkward kind of house arrest instead. And one family in particular turns that into an entire post-war survival strategy. Which brings us to the people who do not get fancy house arrest. They get the classic, no-frills, enjoy-your-cell experience. Let's start with 2 of the worst, Antonin Dolohov and Thorfinn Roell. If you're wondering why those names make your stomach clench, it's because Dolohov has basically been Voldemort's murder guy since the First War. This is the Death Eater who tortured the Prewets, who nearly killed Hermione in the Department of Mysteries with that purple slashing curse, and who shows up at the Battle of Hogwarts like it's his favorite music festival. He's not just a background baddie, he's a one-man obituary generator. And he doesn't stop. During the final battle, Dolohov duels and kills Remus Lupin. The books don't linger on it. But yeah, take a moment. The quiet, cardigan-wearing defense against the dark arts teacher who literally taught you how to conjure a Patronus? Taken out by this guy. Tonks dies in the battle too, and while the text doesn't name Dolohov for her specifically, he is absolutely part of that same wave of old-school Death Eater violence tearing through Hogwarts. Now pair him with Thorfinn Roell, his frequent partner in crime. Roell is the big, blonde, smash-first-ask-questions-never type who attacked the trio in Tottenham Court Road after they escaped Bill and Fleur's wedding. That chaotic Muggle cafe showdown with spells flying, tables exploding, and Hermione having to obliviate witnesses for the first time. That was Roell and his buddy Dolohov trying to bag Harry like it's just another Tuesday. These two keep popping up together. Raids, chases, general chaos. They're the double act of, what if we solved every problem with murder? Which, if you've been paying attention, is kind of the Death Eater brand. After the war, though, the brand stops selling. We get a canon note that both Dolohov and Roll are tracked down, recaptured, and shipped straight back to Azkaban under Kingsley Shacklebolt's new ministry. Same island, very different vibe. No Dementors, no soul-sucking despair as a business model, and actual human-run security instead of hope the monsters are in a good mood today. Look, nobody was surprised that these two didn't get the Imperious defense this time. You don't accidentally kill Lupin. You don't just trip and fall into a Tottenham Court Road massacre attempt. Under Kingsley, the trials are less pure-blood networking event, and more. You did this. We have witnesses. Enjoy your cell. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Or in this case, two. Symbolically, locking Dolohov and Roll away is huge. These are the faces of the old guard, the first war fanatics who never stopped, never regretted anything, and would absolutely have signed up for a third war if someone handed them a Dark Mark loyalty card. Their removal from society is the wizarding world saying, finally, that era is done. The constant, looming threat of random Death Eater attacks? Over. You can send your kid to Hogwarts without factoring Antonin Dolohov into the risk assessment. For now, let's celebrate that some dangers are actually taken off the board. But while these two vanish into a very secure, very deserved obscurity, another infamous family avoids Azkaban entirely. And their version of justice, that's where things get complicated. Hard cut. The roar of Azkaban's waves drops out, and you're inside Malfoy Manor. Quiet. Too quiet. No Dark Lord pacing in front of the fireplace. No masked followers crowding the carpet. No snatchers dragging in terrified Muggleborns. Just echoing corridors, long shadows, and a house that looks like it's still trying to remember how to breathe without Voldemort in it. Let's start with the basics. The Malfoys are alive. They're at home. They are not in Azkaban, which, if you've been paying attention, already makes them statistical miracles in the post-war Death Eater population. But this isn't freedom. This is house arrest with better wallpaper. Lucius Malfoy, former peacock of the pure blood world, is a wreck. Wand snapped, reputation in pieces. The man who once bought influence with a smirk and a checkbook now can't even buy a polite nod at flourish and blots. He shuffles through his own halls like a ghost, apparently afraid of both the ministry and his own reflection, because both know exactly what he did. Narcissa is different, calm, controlled, but permanently on edge, like she's waiting for Aurors to knock every time the clock chimes. The only reason she's not in a cell is the thing you remember from the forest. She lied to Voldemort and saved Harry's life. Kingsley's ministry files that under extremely relevant mitigating circumstance. So she ends up in this weird limbo. Not forgiven, not imprisoned, constantly watched. And Draco? Draco Malfoy, former school bully, reluctant Death Eater, and full-time bad life choice enthusiast, is stuck in the middle. Too young to be written off as irredeemable, too involved to escape scrutiny. Every owl, every visitor, every Gringotts withdrawal is tracked. He walks through the drawing room that once held Charity Burbage's body and can't even look at the ceiling. Because the ceiling tells on them. The drawing room is trashed. Dust hangs in the air. The chandelier that crashed during the escape from Malfoy Manor never quite went back the same way. Crystal is missing. The metal frame is bent, and the whole thing sags like the house is tired. The long table where Voldemort held court is scorched and gouged, a permanent burn mark where curses went wild. This used to be the set of every pure blood power fantasy. Now it looks like a crime scene nobody wants to tape off. Here's the irony. The house that hosted war meetings is now a gilded cage. The Malfoys can walk from the library to the drawing room, but not back into polite wizarding society. They're technically free, practically radioactive. Look, nobody was surprised when invitations stopped arriving. Who's going to seat Lucius next to Auntie Muriel at a wedding and just hope politics doesn't come up? If you're wondering whether Draco ever escapes this mausoleum vibe, we'll get to that later. Because somehow, this family that literally had Voldemort living in their living room ends up with their only heir quietly doing homework in the rebuilt Hogwarts library. Yeah. Take a moment. From human sacrifice centerpiece to please use a coaster on the library table. The Ark. The absolute Ark. And the road from this broken chandelier to a slightly awkward, actually decent adult Draco. That's where the Malfoy story gets really interesting. Event number 7. Lucius Malfoy. From Kingmaker to Wandless. Nobody. From Draco's awkward redemption arc. Let's start with the man who was supposed to make that arc impossible. Lucius Malfoy. The Peacock. The Kingmaker. The guy who walked into Flourish and Blots like he owned the wizarding world and half the ministry. After the war? He can't even walk into Ollivander's and buy a wand. Track the fall. In the First War, Lucius plays it perfectly. He throws money at the ministry, claims the Imperious defense, and slides back into high society with his cane, his smirk, and his cursed diary. He definitely knew nothing about, thank you very much. Second time around, he's not just a donor. He's in Voldemort's inner circle, sitting at the long table, hosting meetings, literally turning Malfoy Manor into evil headquarters. And then he blows it. He loses the diary. He fails to get the prophecy. He gets arrested. By Half-Blood Prince, Lucius is in Azkaban while his master borrows his house and his dignity at the same time. By Deathly Hallows, the once terrifying patriarch is a shaking, desperate mess, staring at Voldemort holding his wand like a kid, watching someone snap their favorite toy. If you're wondering why Lucius isn't rotting in Azkaban at the end, the answer is simple and brutal. The Malfoys betray the cause at the last second. Not out of principle, out of love and fear. Narcissa walking into the forest, lying to Voldemort's face, and choosing her son over her Dark Lord is the key that unlocks all of their prison cells. She saves Harry's life, which, if you've been paying attention, is basically like saving the entire future ministry's favorite person. So when Kingsley's new government starts sorting Death Eaters into Azkaban forever, and maybe we don't waste political capital on this one, the Malfoys land in the second pile. They're interrogated, absolutely. Their testimony is used, their house is searched, their vaults are quietly audited. But they avoid a formal sentence. No Dementors, no life term. The price? Lucius ends up effectively declawed. His wand is confiscated. Any hope of political influence is gone. And you can bet the Auror office has a permanent Malfoy file and a very bored junior Auror assigned to watch that manor. Socially, the punishment might be worse. Pure Blood Society used to see Lucius as glamorous, dangerous, the man who always backed the winning side. After the war, he's the guy whose drawing room became a torture chamber, whose dark mark invitations got people killed, and who managed to back the losing side twice. Yeah, take a moment. For now, let's celebrate the poetic justice. Lucius wanted power, prestige, control over the ministry, over Hogwarts, over everything. He ends up with money, shame, and a haunted thumb that probably still twitches for a wand he'll never legally own again. From Kingmaker to wandless nobody. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. And while Lucius fades into this quiet, miserable retirement, the wizarding world still has a lot of louder Death Eaters to deal with next. From Kingmaker to Wandless Nobody. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. But while Lucius is busy perfecting the art of regret in an over-decorated drawing room, the Malfoy family's actual survival hinges on someone else entirely. Narcissa, the quiet one, the one who never got a dramatic speech or a dark mark close-up. And yet, in the Forbidden Forest, she pulls off one of the single most important moves in the entire war. Let's start with that moment. Voldemort kills Harry, sends Narcissa to check the body, and she does what every Slytherin mother with functioning survival instincts would do. She asks one question: is Draco alive? Harry says yes, and Narcissa Malfoy, pure-blood princess, black family aristocrat, looks the Dark Lord in the face and lies. She tells him Harry is dead, knowing full well he isn't, because a fake victory parade is the fastest way to get back inside Hogwarts and find her son. She doesn't just save Harry, she sabotages Voldemort's win condition in real time. After the war, that tiny whispered lie becomes very loud in ministry files. Under Kingsley's new regime, everybody is asking, who helped, who resisted, who tried to run, and who was still throwing killing curses at teenagers at 3 a.m.? Narcissa's act is officially recognized as a key turning point, which, if you've been paying attention, gives the Malfoys something no other Death Eater family has: leverage. So, when the trials start and the surviving Death Eaters are getting marched into court, the Malfoys don't walk in as Voldemort's inner circle. They walk in as the family who abandoned him at the end and whose matriarch literally saved Harry Potter's life. You can imagine the negotiation, detailed cooperation in exchange for staying out of Azkaban. Names, dates, who attended which meeting at Malfoy Manor, what happened when the Muggle Studies professor was dragged in, which prisoners were kept where. If you're wondering what Narcissa is like on the witness stand, picture ice-cold composure with weaponized politeness. She is not ranting about blood purity. She is carefully, surgically distancing herself from Voldemort's ideology while still owning just enough truth to keep the Aurors interested. She hosts Death Eater meetings, sure, but as Lucius's wife. She obeys, she fears, she protects her son. She is not the fanatic, she's the collateral. And here's a crucial canon detail. Narcissa is never branded with the dark mark. She's Death Eater adjacent, not officially in the club. That matters in a post-war legal system trying to separate true believers from people trapped in the orbit of a madman. The new ministry leans hard on that technicality. No mark, crucial lie, full cooperation. Azkaban dodged. After that, Narcissa's entire life mission reboots around one project: Draco's future. His wand is tainted by war, his name is radioactive, and she is done letting Dark Lords design his personality. For now, let's celebrate the irony. Voldemort's loyal society family ends up raising the Malfoy heir he would have absolutely hated. We'll get to Draco's slow-motion redemption later, but just know this: the boy who once bragged about his father's connections goes back to Hogwarts carrying his mother's lie, his family's second chance, and a very different idea of what the Malfoy legacy is supposed to be. And while the Malfoys are quietly rebuilding, the Ministry still has a backlog of far less cooperative Death Eaters to hunt down next. Event number 9. Draco Malfoy. From would-be killer to reluctant adult. From bragging about his father to praying his father doesn't get arrested. The arc. The absolute arc. Let's start with Draco during the war, because if you're wondering whether he was some fearless mini Voldemort, he absolutely was not. At Malfoy Manor, he's handed the Golden Trio like a pop quiz he didn't revise for, and he still can't positively ID Harry. He stalls, he hedges, he basically goes, could be? While Bellatrix is 2 seconds from homicide. That's not loyalty. That's a terrified 17-year-old trying not to get anyone killed, including himself. Fast forward to the Battle of Hogwarts. When the trio saves him from the fiend fire in the Room of Requirement, Draco doesn't suddenly become best friends forever, but he also doesn't keep fighting with any real conviction. On the battlements, when the Death Eaters regroup and Voldemort calls students over, Draco walks, sure. But during the final chaos, his wand comes down. No dramatic speech, no heroic duel. Just a boy who is clearly in over his head, watching his side lose and quietly opting out. So what does the shiny new ministry do with that? Kingsley and the post-war Wizengamot look at Draco and see a pattern they've seen before. A minor, surrounded by Death Eaters, coerced into service with the kind of pressure only Lucius Malfoy can provide, which, if you've been paying attention, is a lot. Lucius is disgraced. Narcissa literally lies to Voldemort in the forest to save Harry, and that single act becomes Exhibit A in the Malfoy defense package. The story is simple. The parents broke with Voldemort at the end. The son never actually killed anyone, and the family cooperates fully. Draco ends up avoiding Azkaban, but it's not a free pass. He surrenders his wand, his status, and that whole smug, "my father will hear about this" persona. For years, he's the wizarding world's favorite cautionary tale, the pale, pointed reminder of what happens when you flirt with fascist snake wizards. He rebuilds under constant scrutiny, staying away from known Death Eater circles, keeping his head down while Harry and the Aurors mop up the worst of his dad's old colleagues. And slowly, painfully, he steps away from overt pure-blood supremacy. The Malfoy name still carries weight, but now it's more awkward silence at dinner parties than terrifying political influence. Enter Astoria Greengrass. She's from another old pure-blood family, but she has zero interest in reliving the greatest hits of blood purity. Astoria is canonically more moderate, more thoughtful, and apparently very done with Dark Lord fan clubs. Together, they raise Scorpius in a house that's less dark arts dungeon and more anxious nerd library, where the kid is allowed to be kind, bookish, and absolutely not branded with someone else's ideology. For now, let's celebrate that quiet redemption. Draco doesn't become a hero. He becomes something rarer in this world. A former bully who actually learns, apologizes in actions, and chooses not to pass the trauma down. Yeah, take a moment. Because while Scorpius gets a relatively peaceful, if socially awkward, Hogwarts experience, not every former Death Eater's kid is that lucky. And some of those legacies are about to explode right when the epilogue generation shows up. So while Malfoy Manor is dealing with awkward family dinners and generational guilt, smash cut to the middle of the sea. Azkaban. A jagged rock, a gray sky, and waves that look personally offended. But if you're wondering why it feels different, you're not wrong. The screaming silence? Still there. The Dementors? Gone. Fired. Kingsley Shacklebolt walks in as interim Mister, looks at the wizarding world's favorite war crime mascots, and basically says, absolutely not. Let's start with the obvious. They literally sided with Voldemort. Again. The Ministry had trusted creatures whose entire business model was eat sadness, and was then shocked when they took a better offer. But it's not just about loyalty. Kingsley, who has actually met a moral compass before, decides that state-sponsored soul destruction is not a cute look for the new regime. The whole point of this post-war world is to be better than Voldemort, not copy his vibe with more paperwork. So out the Dementors go, driven away from Azkaban's perimeter, pushed back to remote areas while the Auror Office figures out what to do with them long-term. We'll get to that later. Without Dementors, you'd think Azkaban might become some kind of chill seaside getaway. Yeah, no. If you've been paying attention, you know the Ministry overcorrects hard. The prison gets layered in reinforced wards, anti-disapparition fields, anti-portkey traps, alarms that scream if you so much as try a summoning charm. Cells are re-enchanted, so wands fizzle, Patronuses sputter, and animagus transformations flat-out fail. Instead of floating nightmares, you now have rotating teams of highly trained aurors and hit wizards shipped in and out so nobody goes stir-crazy enough to join a breakout. It's less supernatural horror movie, more maximum security fortress where every guard has homework from Hermione's training manuals. Apparently, basic competence is the new dark art. For the surviving Death Eaters, this is complicated. On paper, their punishment is still brutal. Lifetime sentences, isolation, no wand, no chance to imperious their way out of responsibility this time. Dullahoff, Roll, the Karos, the whole greatest hits album of terrible life choices, end up locked away where they can't recruit, can't terrorize, and can't sneak out for a quick muggle-baiting weekend. But without Dementors, their despair is no longer magically dialed up to 11. They feel guilt, boredom, rage, fear, the normal human cocktail, not the magically weaponized version. Some cling to old ideology. Some rot in regret. Some, very quietly, start wondering if Voldemort was worth it. Spoiler, he wasn't. And this is where it gets thematically messy in the best way. Because while a lot of people would have loved to see the Death Eaters dragged into the cold and kissed into oblivion, couldn't have happened to a nicer group. The new ministry refuses to make Azkaban a copy of Voldemort's nightmare state. Justice? Yes. Torture? No. It means every sentence is a little less satisfying, a little less perfect vengeance. But it also means the wizarding world finally stops pretending you can fight evil by becoming slightly more organized evil, which is great, until you realize not every Death Eater actually ends up behind those new wards. So if not every Death Eater ends up in Azkaban, what about the people who weren't even official Death Eaters? The scavengers, the bounty hunters, the guys who treated Voldemort's regime like a really profitable side hustle. Let's start with the Snatchers. These were basically wizarding world bounty hunting gangs, roaming the countryside looking for muggle-borns, blood traitors, and anyone who looked like they'd read a book once. They hauled people into the Ministry for bounties, which, if you've been paying attention, is extra disgusting when you remember how many terrified kids were on the run. Think of Greyback's crew that caught the trio in the woods. Half feral werewolf, half wannabe tough guys, all morally bankrupt. A lot of those snatchers charge straight into the Battle of Hogwarts, because of course they do. Some die in the chaos. Wrong place, wrong spell, wrong side of a centaur stampede. But many don't. When Voldemort falls and the dark mark literally burns out, the branded Death Eaters are easy to flag. The unmarked henchmen? They just drop their wands, kick some dirt over their dark artifacts, and try to melt back into ordinary wizarding life. Suddenly, last month's enthusiastic bounty hunter is this month's, "Oh, I was just escorting people for processing." Look, nobody was surprised. The wizarding world has seen this movie before, with everyone and their Kneazle claiming Imperius after the First War. Kingsley's ministry is ready this time. The new Auror office, with Harry eventually in the mix, starts tracking snatchers like a very unfun scavenger hunt. They cross-reference arrest records from Voldemort's ministry, testimonies from Muggle-born survivors, and those creepy bounty ledgers that show exactly who got paid to drag who in. If your name shows up next to 10 captured kids and a bonus for excessive zeal, yeah, take a moment. Outcomes are wildly uneven. The violent ringleaders, the ones who tortured, assaulted, or killed, do get prison time. No Dementors, but real walls, real sentences, and no, I was confused about who was in charge excuses. The mid-level opportunists end up with fines, travel restrictions, wand monitoring, and the social equivalent of a howler every time they show their face in Diagon Alley. And then you've got the ones who slip through the cracks entirely. Some change names, move abroad, or disappear into sketchy backwater pubs where nobody asks questions as long as you pay in gold. Their absence fuels all those rumors you hear by the time Albus and Scorpius are at Hogwarts. Secret dark enclaves, ex-snatchers running black market potions rings, old wanted posters quietly taken down when the trail goes cold. For now, let's celebrate that a lot of them are actually held accountable at all, which is already a massive upgrade from the oops amnesty era after the First War. But if you're wondering about the worst of the unmarked monsters, the one who didn't even need a dark mark to be terrifying, Fenrir Greyback doesn't get to fade into the crowd. He faces a very different kind of reckoning. Fenrir Greyback is where the label Death Eater actually starts to feel too polite. He's not branded with the dark mark. He's not sitting at the big boy table trading Latin incantations and family heirloom curses. He's something worse. A freelance monster who looks at Voldemort's war and basically sees an all-you-can-eat buffet. Let's start with what he actually is. A werewolf who doesn't hate his condition, but weaponizes it. Greyback's whole deal is hunting children, biting them young so they grow up angry, traumatized, and loyal to him. He allies with Voldemort not out of ideology, but because it gives him access to more victims, more chaos, and more power inside the shadows of the wizarding world. If you're wondering who invited him, it's the kind of decision you make when your HR department is Bellatrix Lestrange. During the war, Greyback is everywhere you don't want him to be. He mauls Bill Weasley during the attack on the astronomy tower, scarring him for life and turning every full moon into a question mark. He turns up at Hogwarts during the battle, literally aiming for Lavender Brown's throat. He leads snatcher packs across the countryside, dragging in Muggle-born kids, blood traitors, and anyone who looked at a wanted poster the wrong way. While the Death Eaters are doing big, theatrical evil, Greyback is the nightmare in the bushes. Look, nobody was surprised when the new ministry came for him. That no dark mark technicality? Useless. His crimes aren't about secret meetings or unforgivable paper trails. They're physical, brutal, and very public. Parents remember the scars on their children. The Order remembers finding his victims. He's the kind of criminal you don't even need Veritaserum for, because half the Auror office watched him attack people in broad daylight. Under Kingsley's reformed system, Greyback almost certainly ends up in Azkaban for life. No Dementors anymore, which, if you've been paying attention, is an upgrade for literally everyone. But he's not getting some comfy, I was Imperiist cell. You're looking at specialized containment, reinforced wards, maybe Wolfsbane on a schedule, just so he can't use the transformation as a weapon. He becomes a test case for how the post-war ministry handles dangerous magical beings without pretending they're not beings at all. And socially? He's radioactive. The werewolf community, already fighting stigma after Greyback spent years being their worst PR campaign, wants nothing to do with him. Any hope of integration, any progress Remus Lupin died for, starts with saying, Yeah, that guy does not represent us. Greyback ends up isolated from humans and werewolves alike, a monster in a box that nobody visits. In a way, locking him away isn't just about punishing one sadist. It's about closing the door on the war's rawest cruelty, the kind that got under people's skin and stayed there. Removing Greyback from the world is part of how the wizarding world convinces itself that the nightmares are finally over. Or are they? Because while one monster is caged, some of Voldemort's more respectable allies try something else entirely. Rebranding. And that gets complicated. Rebranding the family name is one thing. Rebranding the actual cursed junk in your basement? That's a harder sell. Because here's the part people forget. Killing Voldemort doesn't delete his browser history. His magical footprint is still all over Britain. Cursed heirlooms, booby-trapped cellars, secret wards keyed to Parseltongue, and at least 3 abandoned safe houses where opening the wrong drawer gives you a face full of screaming skulls. The war ends. The homework does not. Let's start with the Horcrux fallout. The Big Seven are gone, sure, but the places they touched don't just bounce back like a rubber ducking charm. You've got a Gringotts vault that recently hosted a soul-fragmented cup and an unhinged dragon jailbreak. You've got Hogwarts rooms that spent years babysitting a diadem of concentrated evil. You've got a perfectly normal Muggle house in Little Hangleton, where a diary and a ring turned the whole property into a low-key, magical hazard zone. If you're wondering whether the Ministry just shrugs and walks away, absolutely not. Under Kingsley, the new Ministry quietly sets up what are basically magical hazmat teams. Think Aurors, Cursebreakers, and very tired archivists, all working together, all paid nowhere near enough. Their job? Track down, neutralize, and catalog every dark artifact, cursed object, and suspiciously bitey book that can be traced back to Death Eater homes and hideouts. They sweep Malfoy Manor. They comb through Nocturne Alley back rooms. They even do discreet checks at Hogwarts, just in case someone's forgotten heirloom is actually a Horcrux-adjacent nightmare. And look, nobody was surprised that this got political fast. Old pureblood families do not enjoy Ministry officials poking around their attics, asking why Grandpa's walking cane occasionally whispers in Parseltongue. The official line is always the same. It's historical. Sure. So is the guillotine. Some of them genuinely don't see the problem, because they grew up with cursed jewelry the way you grew up with slightly haunted family photo albums. Others know exactly what they're hiding and start lawyering up the second an Auror knocks. Gringotts becomes ground zero for the tension. Goblins are already salty about, the whole breaking in on a dragon incident. Now the Ministry wants to audit vaults for dark contamination. Kingsley has to negotiate a delicate agreement where specialized teams can examine certain vaults with goblin supervision, which, if you've been paying attention, is about as relaxing as defusing a bomb made of gold and grudges. And then there's the Pink Office. You remember it. Dolores Umbridge's aggressively cute Ministry lair, walls lined with kitten plates and barely concealed sadism. After the war, that office ends up stuffed with confiscated contraband, blood quills, cursed registration files, and little trinkets. She borrowed from the Death Eater-controlled Ministry. It becomes a goldmine, not just for dark artifacts, but for receipts on how corrupt the old regime really was. For now, let's celebrate that the worst objects get locked away or destroyed. But the deeper these teams dig, the more they realize Voldemort's era didn't just leave behind cursed junk. It left behind a paper trail. And buried in that trail, names, lots of them. Some you know, some you really don't want to. We'll get to that later. Smash cut, no battlefield, no screaming curses, just pink. You're in Dolores Umbridge's office. The kitten plates are still smiling, but the room is empty in the way a crime scene is empty after the bodies are gone. Ministry investigators move slowly, wands out, gloves on, treating every lace doily like it might bite. One of them taps a saucer. The painted kitten hisses. Yeah. Take a moment. Let's start with the visuals, because this is weaponized decor. The faded pink walls, the fluffy cushions, the bows, the framed kittens chasing yarn. It looks like the world's most cursed grandmother's sitting room. But if you've been paying attention, you know this wasn't just an office. During Voldemort's puppet government, this was a command center for persecution. A witch at the filing cabinet mutters a spell, and the drawers unlock with a sound that is way too close to a whimper. Out slide folders. Thick, overstuffed, tied with neat little bows. Names of Muggle-borns, addresses, blood status, investigations, seizure orders for wands and property. Every euphemistic ministry stamp is basically saying, "We ruined this person's life at 10:32 a.m., signed, Dolores." On the desk, an Auror opens a velvet-lined box and just stops. Inside, blood quills. Not one, a collection. Carefully arranged, polished, labeled like a tea set. The same kind of quill she used on Harry, now catalogued as evidence. Look, nobody was surprised she kept them. The surprise is how proud she apparently was of her little torture starter pack. Another investigator pulls down a kitten plate. Behind it, a hidden compartment. Inside are personal records of interrogations she oversaw, transcripts, notes in her tight, looping handwriting, comments like, "Subject uncooperative, recommends Dementor exposure," written between tiny hearts. It's not dark marks and skulls. It's ink, parchment, and a woman who turned bureaucracy into a blunt instrument. This is the grotesque contrast that makes your skin crawl. Lace doilies and torture devices, pastel teacups and systemic persecution, a sugar-scented room that functioned like a low-key dungeon with better lighting. We're not in a battlefield or a dungeon right now. We're in a weaponized stationery cupboard that ran on cruelty and paperwork. And that's the point. Voldemort was open, theatrical evil. Dolores was the kind that smiles, files a form, and destroys you before lunch. The wizarding world needs this paper trail because it shows exactly how many people, just following orders, signed off on horror. Every new drawer they open is another nail in her coffin. Every file, every quill, every smug little note is going to be carried out of this pink nightmare and straight into a courtroom. If you're wondering whether the receipts on Umbridge survived the war, this is your answer. They do. All of them. And when Dolores finally sits in front of the Wizengamot, all this frilly, kitten-covered evidence is going to be stacked higher than her bow. Couldn't have happened to a nicer girl. For now, let's celebrate the fact that the same office where she made children bleed is about to be the reason she never gets near power again. And once the ministry is done here, they still have a lot of names left on that list. Some of them are about to find Aurors at their doors. Bye-bye, Dolores. Let's start with the best news first. All those quills, all those rules, all those smug little smiles, they finally add up to something. A prison sentence. If you're wondering whether the wizarding world just forgot about Dolores Umbridge while they were dragging Death Eaters out of the rubble, absolutely not. Her rap sheet is basically a cursed scroll. Torture detentions at Hogwarts, where she carved words into students' skin. Anti-werewolf legislation that made it almost impossible for people like Remus Lupin to get work. Years of gleeful Muggle-born persecution. Then, when Voldemort took over, she didn't just go along. She enthusiastically collaborated with his regime, wearing that locket and pretending her blood status made her judge, jury, and pink cardigan executioner. After the war, the new ministry doesn't have to dig very far for evidence. Hogwarts alone is a goldmine. You've got Harry, Ron, Hermione, and basically half the school ready to testify about her detentions, her blood quill, and the way she turned education into state-sponsored psychological warfare, which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly the kind of thing Kingsley's ministry is hunting down. Then you add the paper trail, records from the Muggle-born Registration Commission, signed orders, hearing transcripts, files showing she oversaw interrogations, seized wands, and sent innocent people to Azkaban because they stole magic. She literally sat under a giant, ministry-approved statue of a witch crushing Muggles and thought, yes, interior design. Yeah, take a moment. So picture her trial. No more hiding behind titles or kitten plates. No High Inquisitor badge. Just Dolores Jane Umbridge, standing in the same courtroom where she once watched other people be condemned. The Wizengamot isn't intimidated by her anymore, because half of them either fought in the Battle of Hogwarts or lost someone to the regime she propped up. Witness after witness comes forward. Former students describing scars on their hands. Muggle-borns who were dragged in front of her commission. Ministry workers who saw her grabbing power every time someone looked away. It's not one big crime, like conjuring a dark mark. It's 1,000 small, vicious abuses of power that together paint the picture of someone who loved cruelty as long as it came with a form to sign. Rowling's been clear about her fate. Umbridge ends up in Azkaban, not for being a Death Eater, but for her crimes against Muggle-borns and her systemic abuse of authority. And remember, this is Azkaban without Dementors, but with real security. So she doesn't get her soul sucked out. She just has to live with herself. Honestly worse. For now, let's celebrate the symmetry. The woman who weaponized rules, quills, and job titles ends up in a place with no kittens, no lace, no power, and absolutely no one who calls her Madam Undersecretary ever again. Just another prisoner number in a cold cell, while the rebuilt ministry she tried to hijack starts cleaning up the rest of Voldemort's leftovers. And some of those leftovers are a lot more dangerous than one bitter bureaucrat in pink. Umbridge was the easy one. The real headache for the rebuilt ministry is the people who didn't wear skull masks, but absolutely helped the nightmare happen. The old guard, the cowards, the "I was just following orders" crowd. Let's start with the difference between a Death Eater and a ministry puppet. Take Yaxley versus Pious Thickness. Yaxley is the real deal. Marked, loyal, happily crashing weddings, and rewriting Muggle-born law like it's his hobby. Thickness? He's what happens when your boss forgets basic security and walks into work imperious. Voldemort literally turns him into a meat-suit minister so he can run the wizarding world by remote control. If you're wondering what happens to people like that after the war, it's not as simple as, "Oops, my bad." Kingsley's ministry actually builds a proper protocol for imperious victims. Healers from St. Mungo's, curse breakers, and mind healers go through their memories, magical signatures, and long-term behavior. They're looking for gaps, forced compulsion patterns, and whether you secretly enjoyed ordering executions on your lunch break. People like Thicknessa are ruled to have had no free will while under the curse, which, if you've been paying attention, is a huge shift from the "everyone just say imperious and go home" era after the First War. The ministry publicly clears them of criminal intent, but still quietly removes them from anything important. No more top-level access, no more sensitive departments, You don't go from Voldemort's puppet back to in charge of national security like it's a casual Tuesday promotion. Then you've got Cornelius Fudge, the human embodiment of an ostrich with its head in the sand and its feet in a stack of daily profits. Fudge isn't imperious. He's just weak, vain, and so terrified of losing power that he spends a year gaslighting the entire wizarding world about Voldemort's return. That cowardice gives Voldemort time to rebuild, recruit, and take over from the inside. Look, nobody was surprised when Fudge doesn't end up in Azkaban. He didn't cast unforgivables. He just created the perfect conditions for people who loved them. So his punishment is social and historical. Forced retirement. Public disgrace. He's that name in history of magic students whisper about when they talk about how not to be minister. The books write him as the man who failed to listen to Harry Potter and helped doom a generation. Yeah, take a moment. Meanwhile, Kingsley is not here to play. He orders a full ministry purge, department audits, internal inquiries, and a quiet but brutal firing spree. Anyone who built their career on pure-blood favoritism, muggle-born harassment, or looking the other way while Death Eaters climbed the ladder? Gone. All of them. For now, let's celebrate HR actually doing its job. War-tested witches and wizards who resisted the takeover end up promoted into key roles, especially in law enforcement and regulation. And one of those promotions is about to reshape how dark magic is policed for an entire generation. Because the Auror Office is about to get a new star recruit. And you already know his scar. Meet Auror Potter. The promotion nobody was surprised by. After you defeat the most feared dark wizard of the century before you're legally allowed to drink fire whiskey, HR kind of stops asking about your NEWT scores. Let's start with that. Harry never goes back to sit his NEWTS. No exam timetables, no quills scratching, no McGonagall stress walk. Kingsley's new ministry looks at his war record, infiltrated the ministry, broke into Gringotts, led a castle siege, personally ended Voldemort, and basically goes, yeah, that's your application. If you're wondering, the Auror Office had never seen a CV like died once, came back, still willing to work weekends. Once he's in, everything changes. The old Auror Office was talented, but kind of stuck in Mad-Eye Moody cosplay mode, constant paranoia, secretive, and very into doing things because that's how we've always done it. Harry walks in with actual battlefield experience against Death Eaters, Snatchers, and a ministry that went full fascist, and suddenly the focus shifts. Less paperwork bravado, more real-world defense. Less, can you identify this obscure jinx in theory? More, can you survive if 5 masked lunatics apparate into your kitchen at 3 a.m.? He pushes for practical training, group drills, and coordination with Muggleborns who know how dictatorships work. And inside the department, he's brutal about one thing. No more Death Eater fan club energy. Any Auror with, maybe Voldemort had a point about blood status vibes? Gone. Kingsley backs him. Together, they strip out the quiet bigotry that let people like Yaxley climb the ladder in the first place, which, if you've been paying attention, was how the ministry fell so fast during the war. Out in the field, Harry becomes the wizarding world's full-time dark wizard hunter. Dolohov, Raoul, the scattered snatchers who thought they could disappear into the countryside. He helps track them down and send them back to a Dementor-free Azkaban that actually has security now. But it's not just people. He goes after cursed artifacts, hidden Horcrux wannabes, and sketchy family vaults where old pureblood lines have been hoarding dark magic like it's a retirement plan. This is the quiet sequel to the books nobody talks about. Year after year, Harry is out there making sure there isn't a Voldemort, but make it Gen Z waiting in the wings. Every confiscated artifact, every broken blood purity ring, every would-be Dark Lord shut down early is another future war that never happens. You don't get a prophecy for that. You just get slightly less cursed grandchildren. Emotionally, it's brutal and healing at the same time. The kid who spent his childhood being hunted ends up choosing a life where he does the hunting, but this time on his terms, with backup, with rules. The nightmares don't vanish, but the job gives them purpose. Every time he collars some masked coward who used to torture for fun, a tiny piece of that helpless boy in the cupboard gets to stand up and say, "Not anymore." Yeah, take a moment. And while Harry is out hunting the last shadows of Voldemort across the wizarding world, someone else is rebuilding the place where those shadows finally broke. The castle, the classrooms, the house tables, because Hogwarts itself is about to get a second life, and a very familiar headmistress has plans. So, zoom out from the Auror files and the dim ministry corridors and jump cut to something way weirder. A bright red train, steam, owls, and a platform full of kids who have literally fought in a war, standing next to 11-year-olds who still sleep with stuffed measles. Welcome back to the Hogwarts Express, because yeah, after the Battle of Hogwarts, they reopen the school. It's not instant, but it's fast enough that some of the same students who watched giants smash courtyards and Death Eaters duel in hallways are now doing homework in them. You've got battle-scarred 7th and 8th years going back to finish exams, sitting right beside first years who grew up hearing, "Eat your vegetables or you know who will get you." Healthy parenting all around. Let's start with the castle itself. The last time you saw it, bridges were exploding, courtyards were craters, and the Great Hall was basically a magical field hospital. After the war, Hogwarts is patched, repaired, and re-enchanted. The wooden bridge Neville ran across? Rebuilt. The shattered towers? Restored. Protective enchantments are layered back on thicker than a Weasley jumper. Reopening the doors isn't just about bricks and wards, it's the wizarding world saying, "This is a school again, not a dark arts summer camp." And the staff? Completely different vibe. McGonagall finally becomes headmistress, which, if you've been paying attention, is the promotion she'd been spiritually doing since Philosopher's Stone. She stabilizes everything. The Carrows are gone, the High Inquisitor days are over, and defense against the dark arts is no longer cursed, so they can actually keep a teacher longer than a carton of milk. The new curriculum doesn't pretend the war was some awkward phase. They talk about Voldemort. They talk about Death Eaters. They teach what Imperius looks like, how propaganda works, and why "I was just following orders" is not a personality. Pattern interrupt for your brain. Imagine a history of magic essay that actually mentions Harry, and Snape, and the DA. You're in class, and your homework is literally, explain the Battle of Hogwarts and evaluate ministry failures. That's the level of self-awareness McGonagall's Hogwarts is aiming for. But here's where it gets really messy. It's not just Gryffindor heroes and Hufflepuff cinnamon rolls filing back in. Children of Death Eaters also return. Draco, in the short term, has to walk those corridors again as the guy who pointed out Dumbledore on a tower and watched his aunt torture a classmate. Later, his son Scorpius shows up in the same castle, sharing classrooms with the kids of Order members and victims. Malfoys, Weasleys, Longbottoms, all at the same house tables, pretending the last generation didn't try to kill each other. Look, nobody was surprised that tension stuck around. You've got parents who fought on opposite sides meeting at the same Quidditch matches. Some families whisper, "Death Eater," under their breath. Others insist it's all in the past. The kids are caught in the middle, doing group projects with the surnames their grandparents cursed. For now, let's celebrate that Hogwarts is standing, sorted, and studying again. But this rebuilt school is living with the fallout of every choice the Death Eaters made, and the next wave of reforms and personal reckonings is about to hit those families directly. And in the middle of all that generational drama, one kid who used to lose his toad quietly becomes the anti-Death Eater blueprint. Let's start with Neville Longbottom, because his arc is so satisfying it feels fake. This is the same boy who got hung from a chandelier by pixies and forgot the password so often the fat lady probably had him blocked. By the end of the war, he's literally running Hogwarts. While Harry, Ron, and Hermione are off hunting Horcruxes, Neville is back at school, turning Dumbledore's army into a full-time underground resistance. Under the Carrows, Hogwarts basically becomes dark arts summer camp, torture detentions, public beatings, the whole charming package. And Neville is the one who keeps standing up, getting hexed, and then standing up again. He defies Snape to his face, keeps the DA alive in the room of requirement, and becomes the kid first years whisper about like he's already on a chocolate frog card. Then the Battle of Hogwarts hits. You remember the moment. Voldemort thinks he's won, offers Neville a spot in his new world order, and Neville answers by pulling the Sword of Gryffindor out of the sorting hat like he's in some kind of medieval mic drop competition. One swing. Nagini gone. The final Horcrux destroyed by the kid who couldn't keep track of his remembrall. Yeah, take a moment. So what does a war hero do after all that? Become an Auror? Start a radical political movement? If you're wondering, Neville goes in a completely different direction. He ends up back at Hogwarts as the herbology professor. The castle where he was bullied, broken, and hunted literally becomes his workplace. That choice is huge. The greenhouses, which used to be where he blew up plants and his own eyebrows, turn into this safe, slightly chaotic jungle where kids learn that dangerous things can be handled gently. He's not just teaching about venomous tentacula. He's showing a whole generation that you can grow something new in the same place Death Eaters tried to crush you. And look, nobody was surprised that he fit there perfectly. Neville, as a war hero teacher, is the exact opposite of the Carrows. They use their classrooms to terrorize students into obedience. Neville uses his to quietly model resistance and kindness. He's the professor who knows what Crucio feels like and, instead of weaponizing that trauma, makes sure no kid in his class ever feels small for getting an answer wrong. Apparently, it's contagious. His reputation, his story, the literal scarred walls of Hogwarts all work together to balance out the legacy of Death Eater educators. When a kid hears about the Carrows, they can look across the table at dinner and see the man who stood up to them and won. Outside school, Neville finally gets something no Death Eater ever prioritized: a cozy, ordinary life. He marries Hannah Abbott, fellow DA member and former Hufflepuff, and they end up living above the leaky cauldron while she runs the pub. It's domestic, warm, a little noisy, and absolutely the opposite of the cold, cursed mansions Death Eaters loved posing in. The thematic slam dunk? Neville, once humiliated by Snape and tortured by Bellatrix, grows up to shape young witches and wizards instead of breaking them. He proves that surviving the worst people in the wizarding world doesn't turn you into them. It turns you into the kind of adult who stands between those kids and the next dark mark. And speaking of former Death Eater circles trying to clean up their image, one infamous family line is about to start its very awkward redemption tour back at Hogwarts. And yeah, the award for most awkward first day back at Hogwarts goes to the next Malfoy. Because after everything Draco did, didn't do, and almost did during the war, he ended up sending his own kid through those same castle doors. Let's start with Scorpius. This is not mini Lucius strutting off the train in a peacock coat. Scorpius Malfoy is shy, nervous, book-obsessed, and apparently the kind of kid who would rather memorize the entire Hogwarts library catalog than hex someone in a corridor. He inherits the name, the manner, the vaults, but not the ideology. That's because Draco and Astoria Greengrass make a very deliberate choice. The cycle stops here. Astoria, who grew up in one of those old pureblood families that quietly decided Voldemort was bad for business, pushes hard against the blood purity nonsense. Draco, who has seen Voldemort up close, personal, and screaming about wands, is completely done. Together, they raise Scorpius with stories about war as a warning, not a recruitment brochure. The dark arts are something you study in history, not something you practice in the drawing room. But look, nobody was surprised that the Malfoy name still hits Hogwarts like a bad smell in a crowded compartment. The whispers start on the train. People point. Kids who grew up on bedtime stories about Harry Potter and the Death Eaters see Malfoy and fill in the rest. Dark magic. Dungeons. Probably a secret basilisk in his backpack. The difference now is the institution around him. McGonagall's Hogwarts is not Snape's occupied Hogwarts. No Carrows prowling the corridors, no torture detentions, no headmaster taking secret meetings with Voldemort. Staff watch Scorpius, sure, but they don't hunt him. Teachers judge him on homework, not his father's dark mark. The school that once literally hosted a Death Eater staff meeting in the Great Hall is now the place quietly proving that a surname is not a prophecy. Meanwhile, Draco is doing what every reformed Slytherin dad would do. Panicking. He's overprotective, anxious, and constantly worried that history is about to repeat itself. If you're wondering what post-war trauma looks like in the wizarding world, it's Draco sending too many owls, overreacting to any rumor, and absolutely refusing to let his son get dragged into anyone's grand destiny. No secret missions, no unforgivable curses, no dark lords in the drawing room, thanks. Which, if you've been paying attention, is a massive arc. The boy who once bragged about his father and his connections is now the man quietly shielding his kid from that exact legacy. For now, let's celebrate the fact that in this generation, the children of Death Eaters are allowed to be individuals. Scorpius can be a nerd, a loyal friend, a time-travel disaster magnet, anything but a pre-written villain. Hogwarts is healing, but outside those walls, the Ministry is still chasing down the last, nastiest remnants of Voldemort's inner circle. And some of them aren't nearly as interested in redemption as the Malfoys. And if you're wondering what last, nastiest remnants actually looks like, let's start with the worst of the worst. Bellatrix Lestrange. Voldemort's #1 fangirl, human curse dispenser, and the woman who made Azkaban look like a spa day. She doesn't walk away from the Battle of Hogwarts. She explodes out of it. Literally. Molly Weasley steps up, delivers the single most iconic, "Not my daughter," in wizarding history, and Bellatrix dies laughing 1 second and in pieces the next. For now, let's celebrate. The series' most sadistic Death Eater is gone. Yeah, take a moment. But the Ministry can't just sweep up the dust and call it a day, because Bellatrix didn't only break people, she collected things, dark things. After the war, her Gringotts vault and every property tied to the Lestrange name instantly become high-priority targets for artifact retrieval. Kingsley's new ministry looks at that family tree and goes, "Okay, that's not a vault. That's a crime scene." Look, nobody was surprised. This is the woman who casually stored a Horcrux in her bank box like it was a spare pair of earrings. So when curse breakers and aurors finally get legal permission to crack it open, they're not expecting a few dusty heirlooms. They're bracing for a magical biohazard zone. Inside, you get the greatest hits of generational evil. Cursed heirlooms that bite back if you touch them. Grimoires full of long-forgotten hexes. Ritual tools that still hum with leftover dark magic. There are objects keyed to pain responses, chains that remember Crucio, and trophies taken from raids on Muggle-born homes and Order safehouses. Some items are so corrupt, they're immediately locked in new, heavily warded ministry evidence rooms. Others are quietly destroyed, because nobody wants a future dark wizard speedrunning Bellatrix's Pinterest board. And while the goblins are thrilled to get this walking insurance nightmare out of their tunnels, the emotional cleanup is way messier. Because cursed books can be burned. Cursed memories? Not so much. Neville Longbottom walks into this new world with Bellatrix's name carved into his life. His parents are still at St. Mungo's, still broken by the Cruciatus curse she and her friends used until their minds shattered. The war is over. The Death Eaters are scattered. Her wand is snapped. Her vault is stripped. And yet every visit Neville makes to that hospital ward is Bellatrix's legacy in real time. The Longbottoms aren't the only ones. Survivors of her interrogations at the ministry, Muggleborns who were dragged before her in that courtroom, Order members who watched her kill Sirius and torture Hermione. They all carry invisible souvenirs. The wizarding world locks away the physical evidence of her crimes, while the emotional fallout walks around, teaches at Hogwarts, starts families, tries to sleep. And speaking of Sirius, Bellatrix isn't the only Black family member leaving a mark on the post-war map, because one very old Black property, number 12, Grimmauld Place, is about to get a completely different job. Welcome back to the worst Airbnb in Wizarding London. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, the house that feels like it's actively offended you walked in. Let's start with that hallway. You know the one. Peeling wallpaper, troll leg umbrella stand, and a portrait of Walburga Black that could outscream a mandrake with a megaphone. After the war, that same gloomy corridor is still there, still hidden behind a Fidelius charm, but the power dynamic has flipped. Harry is now the legal owner as Sirius's heir, which means the kid who once got yelled at by every object in this place ends up with a literal Death Eater museum. Family tree of blood, purists on the wall, cabinets full of cursed heirlooms, a whole house that basically whispers, "Have you considered generational trauma?" every time you walk through. If you're wondering, no, he doesn't just leave it to rot like a particularly haunted storage unit. The Order already did some damage during the war, but post-Voldemort, the cleanup goes from, "We should really get around to that," to, "Okay, this is an actual safety hazard." You've got the Black family tapestry broadcasting centuries of pure-blood supremacy, old artifacts humming with dark magic, and who knows how many cursed trinkets Creature tucked away because Master Regulus would have wanted it. So the house gets a second purge. This time, it's not about hiding from Death Eaters. It's about neutralizing what they left behind. Cursed objects are removed, disarmed, or locked down properly, not just shoved in a cupboard and prayed over. The tapestry? At minimum, it's stripped of its enchantments, turning it from a living, hissing record of bigotry into, well, fabric. The venomous heirlooms that once screamed status and ideology become evidence, training tools for aurors, or straight-up ash. For now, let's celebrate the idea of Harry feeding some of this stuff directly into a magically reinforced bin labeled "Absolutely Not." And the symbolism here is loud. This is a place that hosted pure-blood fanatics, a house where Sirius ran away from home and where Voldemort's followers were practically a family hobby. After the war, it becomes a base for an Auror, and, eventually, his family. The same walls that heard Walburga rant about filth now hear kids asking where they left their toy broomsticks. Yeah, take a moment. That's the wizarding world flipping a dark artifact of a building into a safe house, a home, and a reminder that you can inherit horror and still choose something better. It's also a palate cleanser before we dive back into the messy part. Because while Grimmauld Place gets a redemption arc, most Death Eaters do not. Some are hunted down and dragged into courtrooms. Some cut deals. Some disappear into the shadows and wait. And if you've been paying attention, you know the Ministry's brand new justice system is about to be tested by every single one of them. Event number 19. The Not-So-Noble Houses. Dark families after the war. If you're wondering what happened to the big, fancy, pure-blood families who spent 2 wars flirting with fascism, welcome to the most awkward chapter of wizarding high society. Voldemort is gone. The dark mark is out of fashion, and suddenly the old families have to pretend they've never even heard the word mudblood. Yeah, take a moment. Let's start with the Knots, the Parkinsons, and all the other. We're not Death Eaters. We just host them for dinner households. These are the people who donated to the cause, whispered about blood traitors, and sent their kids to Hogwarts preloaded with slurs, while carefully avoiding getting caught in robes and masks. Some, like the Knots, had direct ties to marked Death Eaters. Others stayed just this side of legally deniable, which, if you've been paying attention, was basically the pure-blood Olympic sport. The new Ministry doesn't get to just throw them all into Azkaban and call it a day. Kingsley's whole brand is actual justice, not spin the wheel and blame the nearest Muggle-born. So the old houses get dragged through case-by-case investigations. Who funded what? Who provided safe houses? Who, accidentally, kept a drawer of cursed artifacts in the study? Fines start flying. Vaults get audited. Travel rights get restricted. A few lose seats on the Wizengamot, or cushy advisory posts their grandfathers bought with dragon gold. And then comes the surveillance. These families end up on quiet watch lists, their flu connections flagged, their owls traced, their suspicious charity gatherings politely crashed by Aurors who just happened to be in the neighborhood. Any sign of reorganizing, any hint of a new masked book club, and the Ministry is at the door with warrants. Draco's generation feels this especially hard. If your surname rings any Death Eater bells, you're getting extra bag checks for the rest of your life. But the real punishment? Social. Being a known Death Eater family becomes deeply uncool. The same last names that once opened every door now kill the vibe at parties faster than a Dementor at a birthday brunch. Good marriage matches suddenly dry up. Ministry departments quietly stop hiring your cousins. Flashing your family crest around Diagon Alley gets you side-eye, not discounts. The Malfoys aren't the only ones going from elite to embarrassing almost overnight. Inside these manors, the generational divide turns into open warfare. Younger witches and wizards who grew up seeing Hogwarts literally under siege want nothing to do with blood purity. They've fought alongside Muggleborns, half-bloods, werewolves, and house elves. They've watched Voldemort lose. So when grandfather starts up at dinner about the old ways, the table goes silent, someone coughs, and a niece quietly mentions that Harry Potter's kid is in her year and is actually pretty nice. The older bigots end up trapped at their own dinner parties, surrounded by portraits who agree with them, and living descendants who absolutely do not. For now, let's celebrate that. Because here's the irony. Voldemort tried to build a world where these families would rule unchallenged, a pure-blood-dominated empire run on fear. What he actually did was make their ideology radioactive. Saying blood status out loud in public now brands you as the magical equivalent of that uncle who still thinks the Dark Lord had some good ideas. And as the next generation heads to Hogwarts, the question isn't, will they bring back his world? It's, can they escape their own last names? We'll get to that later. So if the question for the kids is, can they escape their last names? The question for their parents is way darker. Who never walks free again? Because while some Death Eaters slithered back into polite society, a specific category basically got a permanent do not release sticker slapped on their files. Let's start with the easy group, the repeat killers. The people whose entire resume is Azkaban, escaped, murdered, repeat. Antonin Dolohov, the man racked up war crimes like chocolate frog cards. He killed the Prewets in the First War, attacked students in the Department of Mysteries, then strolled into the Battle of Hogwarts like it was his third act encore. After the dust settled, he ended up right back in Azkaban, this time without Dementors, but with actual locks that work. Look, nobody was surprised. Right next to him on the Never Seeing the Sun Again block, you've got Thorfinn Rowell. This is the guy who tried to curse a teenage girl in a Muggle cafe and set a children's bookshop on fire. No imperious defense, no tragic backstory, just pure, unsubtle thug energy. The Reformed ministry looked at his record and basically said, yeah, take a moment, you're done. Then you have the torturers and enforcers, the people who weren't just following orders, they were enjoying it. Alecto and Amicus Caro, the sibling nightmare tag team who turned Hogwarts into a state-sponsored bullying program, are prime examples. They crucioed kids for detention, made first-years watch Muggle studies propaganda, and tried to hand over Neville, Ginny, and Luna. After the war, they're captured, tried, and locked away for life. No mitigating circumstances. No. But I was scared of Voldemort. Everybody was scared of Voldemort. Most people didn't respond by electrocuting children. Yaxley lands in that high-ranking lieutenant category. He infiltrated the ministry, helped rig the Muggle-born Registration Commission, and personally oversaw people being dragged away. The Second War doesn't work without guys like him greasing the wheels, so even though we don't get a neat little "and then Yaxley went to Azkaban" line in the books, every bit of world-building points to him being exactly the sort of lifer Kingsley's ministry makes an example of. Put these together, and you get the real reason there's no organized third wave of Death Eater activity. The brains, the muscle, and the worst sadists are all either dead or in prison forever. Sure, you still have scattered dark families, sketchy dueling clubs, and the occasional cursed artifact turning up in someone's attic. But without Dolohov-level killers and Caro-style enforcers on the outside, nobody can knit that darkness into a proper army again. Psychologically, that matters. A lot. For the first time in decades, ordinary witches and wizards can send their kids to Hogwarts without secretly wondering if they'll come home branded, cursed, or recruited. The knowledge that the worst of the worst are literally stuck on an island makes it possible to rebuild, to forgive, to stop sleeping with your wand under your pillow. Their bodies are in cells. Their wands are snapped. Their cause is fractured. But one very important soul, that one is trapped somewhere far stranger than Azkaban. And if you're wondering what eternal punishment looks like when you've split yourself into 7, We'll get to that later. So let's leave the cells for a second. Slam the Azkaban door shut, cut to white, and remember the weirdest, quietest scene in the entire series. Harry, barefoot and bloody, waking up in that empty, echoing King's Cross that looks like it was designed by IKEA and a fog machine. And under the bench, that thing, that flayed, gasping, half-formed creature whimpering in the corner like a cursed hairless cat. If you're wondering who that actually is, it's not some random demon the station picked up. That is Voldemort. Or rather, what's left of his soul after he's been turned into a magical jigsaw puzzle and then smashed to pieces. Let's start with what Rowling said about this, because it's brutal. She's confirmed that what Harry sees there is basically Voldemort's post-death state. No body, no wand, no dramatic cape swirl. Just the shredded, mutilated core of Tom Riddle, stuck in a place he can't control, can't escape, and can't grow past. He can't board a train. He can't move on. He's just there. Forever. This is the bill coming due for Horcruxes. You don't rip your soul into 7, 8 pieces, stash them in murder trophies, and walk away with a light slap on the wrist. The whole point is that he tried to dodge death so hard that when it finally caught him, he ended up worse off than if he'd just died like a normal garden-variety megalomaniac. And look at the poetic justice. While his followers are getting marched into courtrooms, filing appeals, and arguing about the Imperius Curse, their Dark Lord isn't facing a jury. He's facing nothing. No followers, no speeches, no skull-shaped fireworks in the sky. Just his own broken soul for company. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Everyone else gets processed through human systems. Kingsley's ministry, Auror squads, Azkaban without Dementors, all the messy, bureaucratic stuff of a world trying to be better. Voldemort? He doesn't even get that. He's stuck in a self-made purgatory where nobody's listening, nobody's impressed, and nobody's coming to rescue him this time. Yeah, take a moment. The series loves redemption arcs. Snape, Draco, even Dudley manages to pull it together. But Voldemort is the hard exception. No last-minute apology, no teary confession, no "I misjudged love" monologue. His ending is the non-ending, an eternity as the magical equivalent of a burned-out hard drive, whimpering under a bench in a station he can't leave. Which, if you've been paying attention, is the thematic anchor for everything that happens after. The war's final boss is off the board permanently. No resurrection, no secret Horcrux, no Part 3. And with him locked into that white, echoing nowhere, the story shifts. Because now the real question isn't, will Voldemort come back? It's what everyone else does when he absolutely can't. So if Voldemort is permanently soft-locked in cosmic timeout, what happens to everyone who spent years tattooing his logo on their arms? The answer is, the war keeps going. Quieter, colder, more paperwork. Because even after the big names are in chains, the wizarding world is still littered with problems. Scattered loyalists who slipped away in the chaos. Hidden cellars full of cursed artifacts and stolen wands. And apparently, a whole depressing wave of teenagers who read about Voldemort and went, "Wow, aesthetic." Yeah, take a moment. Let's start with the Auror Office 2.0. Under Kingsley, Harry, and a new crop of war-hardened witches and wizards, the Aurors stop being the slightly overwhelmed police department and become the people quietly making sure this never happens again. No fanfare, no profit headlines, just night raids, sealed reports, and a lot of very tense tea in the office. You get small teams apparating into remote manors at 3 in the morning, stunning some last-ditch fanatic still sleeping under a giant dark mark tapestry, undercover aurors nursing fire whiskey in Nocturne Alley, pretending to be interested in cursed opal necklaces while actually mapping who's buying what, long-term surveillance charms on former snatchers, ex-inquisitorial squad families, and anyone who keeps saying, "He who must not be named had some good ideas, actually." And because Harry ends up a leading auror way too young, the culture shifts. He's the guy who literally lived through wrongful arrests, corrupt officials, and the ministry trying to hand him over to Voldemort. So he walks in and says, "No torture, no unforgivable for fun, no dementors, ever." You want confessions? You get them with Veritaserum and solid evidence, not Cruciatus practice. Look, nobody was surprised that Kingsley backed him. Kingsley's the one who fired the soul suckers from Azkaban, which, if you've been paying attention, is the single biggest vibe change in wizarding justice history. Together, they push for actual training, clear rules, and a very simple line. Dark magic trafficking, blood purity hate groups, and cursed object dealing get shut down hard. That's where the copycats come in. You've got wannabe Dark Lords in bad masks throwing around Latin they barely understand, dueling behind pubs and talking about finishing the work. They romanticize Voldemort like he was some tragic anti-hero instead of a noseless war criminal with a snake problem. The aurors treat them like what they are, dangerous, but also deeply embarrassing. Cells get rolled up fast. A new order meeting in a Wiltshire barn, raided before they can finish arguing over who gets to be second in command. A black market ring selling fake Horcruxes to edgy rich kids, busted, cataloged, and used as a training exercise. But while the aurors are busy playing whack-a-mole with dark wizards, the smarter people in the ministry know you can't just arrest your way out of this. If you're wondering how you stop the next Voldemort before he's brewing snake milk in a graveyard, it's not just about better dueling. We'll get to that later, but the short version is, laws start changing, Hogwarts starts teaching differently, and the way the ministry treats werewolves, muggleborns, and every other problem group finally goes under the microscope. The raids deal with the symptoms. What comes next is an attempt to fix the disease. So how do you Voldemort-proof a government that literally let Voldemort come back twice? You start rewriting the rulebook that let Fudge and Scrimgeour play political musical chairs while a snake-faced war criminal took over the office. Let's start with the Wizengamot and the ministry itself. Kingsley looks at the old system, where a minister could cling to power as long as they could dodge scandals and buy enough peacock quills, and says, yeah. Take a moment. Term limits. Ministers only get a set number of years, and chief warlocks can't just sit in those purple robes until they fossilize. Sessions are recorded, voting records become public, and backroom "I swear I was Imperiist" deals are a lot harder to hide because actual oversight committees now exist. If you're wondering whether anyone trusted those committees, not really at first. But after decades of fudge-level denial and let's ignore the Dark Lord in the room energy, people are ready for boring accountability. Departments have independent auditors, auror arrests need proper documentation, and emergency powers are time-limited, so one paranoid minister can't turn the whole wizarding world into Umbridge's vision board overnight. Speaking of Umbridge, her legal legacy gets absolutely torched. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. All that blood status bureaucracy, the Muggleborn Registration Commission, the werewolf employment bans, gone. New laws explicitly protect Muggleborns from discrimination in schooling, jobs, and wand licensing, which, if you've been paying attention, is the exact opposite of Voldemort's "no wand for you" philosophy. Werewolves and other so-called dangerous creatures finally get someone reading their files who isn't just doodling fangs in the margins. Hermione, years later as minister, pushes through regulations that focus on access to treatment, wolfsbane support, and workplace protections instead of lock them up every full moon and hope they don't unionize. Goblins, house elves, and part humans get incremental rights boosts too. It's not perfect, but compared to the Umbridge era, it's like going from a locked cupboard to an actual bedroom. Then you have dark magic itself. After spending 7 years playing cursed object bingo, the Ministry finally admits that maybe, just maybe, they should define what dark actually means. New statutes list specific curses, rituals, and artifacts as prohibited, with clear categories: banned for anyone, restricted to heavily vetted researchers, and absolutely do not put this in your attic like a gaunt family heirloom. Trafficking cursed objects gets way steeper penalties, and the old "I didn't know that locket screamed in Parseltongue" excuse stops working. Nocturne Alley still exists, but it's crawling with undercover aurors and paperwork. So much paperwork. Of course, all this security comes with strings. Some witches and wizards start grumbling that the Ministry is watching everything. Are they going to outlaw half the library because one spell looks a bit too green? Civil liberties groups pop up, arguing that fear of another Dark Lord is being used to justify constant surveillance and harsher sentences. But the memory of Voldemort is fresh. Parents who watched him float through the sky like a homicidal screensaver mostly shrug and say, "If it keeps our kids alive, fine." And the irony. A society that once refused to even say Voldemort's name now has entire legal codes, committees, and training manuals dedicated to making sure nobody like him rises again. The name they wouldn't speak quietly ends up running the whole conversation. And if you're wondering whether the laws alone actually work, or if prejudice just finds sneakier ways to survive, we'll get to that later. So the laws change, the trials happen, the Dementors get booted, and on paper, the wizarding world has learned its lesson. But how do people actually talk about Death Eaters when the dust settles? That part is way messier. Let's start with the immediate post-war years. It's raw. You've got fresh graves at Hogwarts, names carved into a memorial wall McGonagall insists on, and families who still can't walk past a certain corridor without crying. People are lighting candles, leaving flowers, quietly repairing shattered shopfronts in Diagon Alley. And while everyone knows who wore the mask and who didn't, nobody really wants to say it out loud at Sunday dinner. In those first years, conversations are careful. You don't ask your healer if they were a snatcher. You don't mention that your uncle worked at the Ministry when that meant he was literally helping register Muggleborns for persecution. The wizarding world becomes a place of half-finished sentences and loaded pauses because calling someone a Death Eater isn't just an insult. It's a reminder that they might have killed your friends. But time is ruthless. Kids grow up who never saw Voldemort. After a while, Death Eaters stop being the people you hid from and start being homework. Hogwarts bakes them into the curriculum. Binns, who apparently can't be fired even by a war, drones about the First Wizarding War. The new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor uses Death Eater tactics as case studies. History essays are suddenly full of analyze the socio-political factors that led to mass recruitment by Voldemort, instead of describe 3 goblin rebellions. And if you're wondering whether the Daily Prophet handles any of this responsibly, look, nobody was surprised. You get sensationalist memoirs from reformed Death Eaters, trashy tell-alls about who was secretly dark, and dramatic headlines like Lucius Malfoy, victim or villain. Spoiler, villain. The man literally kept a diary Horcrux in his daughter's school supplies. Generationally, the split is huge. War survivors see Death Eaters as painfully real. The Carrows torturing kids in detention, Yaxley storming the ministry, Dolohov murdering in broad daylight. They remember hiding, fighting, losing people. Meanwhile, their kids grow up with Death Eater masks as edgy Halloween costumes, like, "Relax, Mum, it's just for a party." For them, it's distant boogeyman energy. Scary, but also kind of stylized and memeable in a way that makes older witches and wizards want to scream into a pillow, which, if you've been paying attention, opens the door to something dangerous: revisionism. Some old pure-blood families scrub their family trees, downplay the dark marks, and start using words like misguided and under pressure a lot. Grandfather didn't torture anyone. He was just confused. Sure, we'll get to that later. Because the final biggest shift isn't just how people remember the Death Eaters. It's what the wizarding world decides to do with all that memory, all that trauma, when it finally gets tired of being afraid. And that choice? That's our last major event. So what does that choice actually look like? Not in court transcripts, not in Wizengamot robes, but in real life, years later, when people have to do something terrifying. Put their kids on a train and let them go. Let's start with the most aggressively normal scene in the entire series. 19 years after the Battle of Hogwarts, you're back at Platform 9 3/4. Same scarlet steam engine, same owls complaining, same parents pretending they're fine while internally screaming. Except this time, look who's sharing the platform. Harry and Ginny, Ron and Hermione. And, oh yeah, Draco Malfoy and his perfectly coiffed midlife crisis hair. Nobody's dueling. Nobody's even pointing a wand. They're just coexisting. In public. With witnesses. You get these tiny, ridiculously human details. James whining about wanting to sit with his friends. Albus panicking about being sorted into Slytherin. Lily trying to negotiate her way onto the train early because, of course, she is a Weasley grandchild. This isn't the Order of the Phoenix briefing room anymore. It's school-run chaos. If you're wondering where all the skull masks are, they're not. No dark marks flashing in the afternoon light. No terrified glances at the sky every time the train whistle blows, waiting for a giant floating skull to appear. The only symbol anybody cares about is the Hogwarts crest on a trunk that keeps trying to escape. And then you get that glance. Harry sees Draco across the platform. Once upon a time, this was the kid who tried to get him killed by a cursed necklace, who stood in a bathroom with him trading Sectum Sempra like it was a group project. Now, it's a nod. Awkward, stiff, but real. Two veterans, two dads, standing in the same space and choosing not to reach for old reflexes. Yeah, take a moment. Because for a world that spent decades organizing its entire personality around who would you take in a Death Eater raid, this is radical. The most extreme image in the series isn't a duel in the Great Hall. It's this boring, ordinary, stomach-churning parent ritual playing out without a single Death Eater in sight. You can feel how far the wizarding world has moved just from the conversations. The kids aren't asking, what if Voldemort comes back? They're worried about houses, homework, and who they're going to sit with. Trauma gets replaced by timetable anxiety, which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly what Harry never got to have. For now, let's celebrate how aggressively uneventful this platform is. No Aurors patrolling with wands half drawn. No Malfoy bodyguards lurking behind Draco. Just former enemies shoved into the same crowd, forced to do the most vulnerable thing together. Let their children out of arm's reach and trust the world not to eat them alive. And that's the pattern interrupt. After all the policy, trials, and prison talk, this is the answer the story quietly gives you. After the Death Eaters doesn't look like a perfect utopia. It looks like this platform, this train, this tiny moment of shared, ordinary courage. The final question is, how do you protect that? We'll get to that later. So how do you protect that little moment on platform 9 3/4? You don't pass one law and call it a day. You let time do the weird, quiet work of turning a Dark Lord into a history essay question. Let's start with the real event here. It's not Kingsley's first speech or Umbridge getting marched into a courtroom, even though that was incredibly satisfying. It's the moment an entire generation grows up with Voldemort as a date on a timeline, not a name you're scared to say out loud. For Harry's kids, you-know-who is literally just homework. Look around this new wizarding world. Kids at Hogwarts worry about Quidditch tryouts, not snatchers on the road. The big drama is who made the house team, who kissed who behind the greenhouses, which professor gives the worst essays. The Carrows are a cautionary tale in history of magic, not the people carving words into your hand. At the Ministry, it's almost comical. The same institution that once let Death Eaters stroll in with skull tattoos is now back to arguing about cauldron thickness and broom regulations. You've got committee meetings where someone is genuinely more worked up about exploding snap accidents than about blood purity. Which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly the point. Boredom is the victory lap. And yet, buried under all that normal, something massive did shift. The Death Eaters lost so hard, so publicly, that the wizarding world had to stare straight at its own reflection. No more pretending it was just a few bad apples in skull masks. Pure-blood families who quietly agreed with Voldemort's ideas suddenly found those beliefs socially radioactive. You couldn't say mudblood in polite company without everybody in the room doing the slow head turn. Voldemort's whole brand was blood purity. That was his thing. And by tying that ideology to war crimes, child torture, and snake-based HR policies, he actually fast-tracked its decline. Yeah. Take a moment. The guy who wanted to preserve pure-blood supremacy ended up making it the most embarrassing opinion you could possibly have at a dinner party. Legally, the ripple effects are everywhere. Kingsley's ministry, Hermione's later reforms, Harry's Auror office, they all grow out of one ugly realization. The old system protected the wrong people. The imperious excuse stops being a get-out-of-Azkaban free card. Laws start asking, who's vulnerable? Not, who's influential? Goblins, werewolves, house elves, muggleborns, people the old ministry treated like background scenery, finally get someone in power actually reading their files. For now, let's celebrate that the everyday gossip is about Chudley cannons losing streaks and Puddlemere transfers, not which Death Eater escaped Azkaban. The world isn't perfect. There's still prejudice, still bad laws to fix, still kids who flinch when someone raises a wand too fast. But it is safer, kinder, and a lot more self-aware. And that quiet, slightly messy, deeply human normal? That's the real victory over the Death Eaters, the one they accidentally built by losing. So, now that we've walked through the quiet, messy normal, let's zoom back out and look at the season you never got to binge. Everything that happened right after All Was Well. Because if you're wondering why the epilogue feels earned and not like a magically convenient reset button, it's all the stuff we just covered. Let's start with the big sweep. The morning after the Battle of Hogwarts, the wizarding world did not just go, "Cool, back to homework." You had the Great Roundup, surviving Death Eaters, Snatchers, and collaborators dragged out of hiding, stunned in forests, yanked out of safe houses, and marched into a ministry that for once wasn't secretly run by the bad guys. Kingsley Shacklebolt takes over, looks at the files, looks at the bodies, and basically starts a multi-year absolutely not tour. We get new trials, real ones. No more "my father bought my way out" packages. No more mass imperious excuses getting rubber stamped. The Carrows, who turned Hogwarts into their personal torture playground, end up in Azkaban, where they belong. Yaxley, Mr. I put the Imperious on the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Goes down hard. Dolohov, serial order member killer? Recaptured, shipped straight back to prison. Greyback, the walking rabies warning? Locked away, because apparently we've decided eats children is finally a deal breaker. Meanwhile, the Malfoys, the pure-blood poster family that spent 6 books being casually evil and rich. Lucius loses everything: his influence, his wand, his terrifyingly good hair days. Narcissa pulls the wildest move of the war, lies to Voldemort about Harry being dead, and accidentally saves the entire resistance. That one choice is why they avoid Azkaban and end up socially ruined instead of legally executed. Draco grows up in the ruins of that name, marries Astoria, raises Scorpius, and quietly backs away from blood purity like it's a cursed necklace in Borgin and Burke's, which, if you've been paying attention, is the only kind of redemption that was ever going to feel honest for him. Institutionally, the world flips. Azkaban stays, but the Dementors get fired. Kingsley kicks out the soul-sucking depression cloaks and replaces them with actual security and oversight. The ministry itself gets a purge. Corrupt officials tried. Muggle-born registration office burned out of the records. New laws written that actually protect Muggle-borns and magical creatures instead of pretending they don't exist. The Auror office becomes a real professional force, not just whoever Dumbledore likes plus some paperwork, and spends years hunting stragglers, dark artifacts, and wannabe copycats trying to cosplay Voldemort. Emotionally, you get the payoffs fandom has been waiting on since childhood. Dolores Umbridge, in prison. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Neville Longbottom goes from anxious disaster child to beloved herbology professor, shaping the kids who grow up never having to choose between detentions and Death Eaters. Hogwarts is rebuilt, rewarded, and reoriented away from propaganda and towards uncomfortable truth. There's a memorial, a history, a promise baked into the stone. And all of that, the roundups, the trials, the reforms, the quiet Malfoy course correction, is the unseen bridge between the smoking rubble of the Great Hall and that peaceful platform in 2017. The books only hint at it, but once you see the hidden season after the finale, the calm doesn't feel cheap. It feels paid for. For now, let's celebrate that victory. Then we're going even darker, into the secrets that didn't make it into any ministry report. So let's start with the uncomfortable part. For all the fireworks of the Battle of Hogwarts, the aftermath is not a perfectly wrapped-up morality play where every villain gets a bespoke cosmic smackdown. Some Death Eaters absolutely went to Azkaban and stayed there. Dolohov, Rowell, Yaxley, repeat killers with rap sheets longer than Filch's detention drawer, got hammered with real sentences under Kingsley's ministry. Look, nobody was surprised. These are the people who didn't just follow Voldemort. They enjoyed the extracurricular murder. But if you're wondering whether everyone got that level of justice, yeah. Take a moment. The answer is no. The new ministry had to deal with a mess of imperious claims, half-truths, and "I was just following orders" speeches that sounded suspiciously well-rehearsed from the last war. Some people really were cursed into service. Others were socially imperious, raised in families where saying no to the Dark Lord was basically saying no to breathing. The Aurors had to sort out who'd been coerced, who'd been cowardly, and who had been gleefully carving Muggleborns for fun. That's why you see this weird split. The Carrows, tortured kids for a whole school year, straight to prison. No one is buying the "we were confused teachers" defense. Meanwhile, lower-level snatchers and bureaucrats who stamped the wrong forms under threat of death sometimes cut deals, turned informant, or quietly got downgraded to probation and a lifetime of ministry supervision. Is that satisfying? Not really. Is it realistic for a traumatized wizarding world trying to move forward without executing half the population? Kind of, yeah. Which, if you've been paying attention, is where the Malfoys become the ultimate gray area case study. Lucius ended up disgraced, wandless, and socially radioactive instead of dead. Narcissa literally saved Harry's life and helped end the war, so she gets mercy with a side of permanent side-eye. Draco walks this tightrope between "I made terrible choices at 16" and "I am not doing this to my kid." That's the quiet redemption arc people miss. Draco and Astoria deciding their son won't be a pure-blood show pony. Narcissa not whispering bedtime stories about the glory days of the Dark Lord. Even unnamed Death Eater families, stripped of power, choosing not to pass the infection on. Redemption here isn't big speeches and Patronus fireworks. It's not raising the next generation to be monsters. The real theme after the war is that balance between justice and mercy. The wizarding world is trying to be better than Voldemort without pretending nothing happened. So you get trials, testimonies, ugly truths dragged into the light, and also plea bargains, second chances, and a lot of people living with what they did. And the wild part? The story after the war is less about dramatic duels and more about paperwork, therapy-level conversations, and very awkward family dinners where someone's uncle used to wear a mask. Which secrets stayed at those tables, and which ended up buried somewhere much darker? So let's drag this out of the pensive and into your hands for a second, because at this point, it's not just about what canon says. It's about what you think the wizarding world did right, and where it absolutely fumbled the quaffle. Let's start with the big one. Which Death Eater, in your opinion, actually deserved a second chance? Not, "my lawyer says imperious" levels of convenient, but genuinely. Are you team, Draco was a terrified kid who got in way too deep? Or are you secretly ready to write a Lucius Malfoy redemption arc where he spends the rest of his life funding Muggleborn scholarships and apologizing to house elves? And who, for you, should have rotted in Azkaban forever, Dementors or no Dementors? Because look, nobody was surprised that people tried the imperious defense again. It was the wizarding world's favorite get-out-of-jail-free card after the First War, and apparently some folks thought they could just recycle the excuse like a bad essay for bins. So do you buy it for anyone outside the obvious victims, like people literally dragged into battle at wand point? Or do you think Kingsley's shiny new ministry still went way too easy on rich, well-connected families who, coincidentally, ended up back in their manor houses instead of a cell? If you're wondering where this gets fun, it's right here. Your headcanons. The books give us Dolohov and Raoul getting shipped back to Azkaban, the Malfoys slinking off into social ruin, and a bunch of named Death Eaters either dead or locked up. But what about the Snatchers we never see again? The random Slytherins who didn't come back for the Battle of Hogwarts? The guy who probably spent the whole war forging dark marks in Nocturne Alley and pretending he was neutral? I want you to pick one of those background characters, and just finish their story. Write me a 3-sentence epilogue for a minor Death Eater, a Snatcher, or even a scared Hogwarts student who made the wrong choice in 6th year. Did they flee the country and open a cursed tattoo shop in Bulgaria? Did they quietly turn themselves in and end up working under Harry in the Auror office, spending every day trying to balance the scales? Yeah, take a moment. Or go wild with it. Tell me your most unhinged but secretly plausible theory about a Death Eater hiding in plain sight during the peaceful years. Is there a respectable Diagon Alley shop that, in your version, is absolutely a front for old Voldemort loyalists? Is one of Harry's co-workers at the Ministry quietly sitting on a stash of dark artifacts that should have been confiscated years ago? Drop your verdicts, your hot takes, and your mini epilogues in the comments, because we're building a whole post-Deathly Hallows wizarding world together here. And for now, let's celebrate that this video is just one stop in that timeline. After we finish with the Death Eaters, we're heading deeper into what the peaceful era really looked like. The kids who grew up in those shadows, and the secrets their parents hoped would stay buried. And if you're already mentally drafting your own post-war syllabus in your head, good. Because this Death Eater roll call? This is literally one chapter of a much bigger, much messier story we're building on this channel. Let's start with the obvious sequel your brain is already demanding. If the villains got trials, cells, and some very poetic karma, what about the heroes? We're diving into what happened to the Order of the Phoenix after the war, the people who went from secret resistance fighters to what, exactly? Middle-aged parents with trauma and a group chat. You've seen them win the battle. Now we're going to track who actually survived the peace. After that, we're heading back to the castle. Hogwarts under McGonagall is basically the post-war school gossip episode you deserve. The protective enchantments, the rebuilt common rooms, the first sorting after the war when every single kid is side-eyeing Slytherin like it's a cursed hat. If you're wondering how you rebuild a school that was literally a war zone last term, we'll get to that later, in painful, delightful detail. And because the wizarding world apparently never gets a break, we're also tackling Kingsley's Ministry 10 years later. The no-nonsense, low-drama minister who fired Dementors, cleaned house, and tried to drag the Ministry into something resembling basic competence. We'll follow how that ended up paving the way for Hermione, the Auror office Harry leads, and whether the new laws actually fixed anything or just put shinier wallpaper over the same old pure-blood cracks. If watching the Death Eater's fates play out scratched a very specific justice itch for you, you're going to love seeing the other side. How the Order, the Ministry, and Hogwarts try to rebuild while carrying all that guilt, grief, and weird fame. The captured Death Eaters got Azkaban. The survivors got therapy they absolutely did not attend. Yeah, take a moment. So if you want in on the full post-Hogwarts cinematic universe, don't just tap subscribe like it's a random button. Enroll. You're signing up for an ongoing wizarding history course where your homework is speculating wildly in the comments, and your exams are pop quizzes on obscure goblin legislation and which Weasley twin pulled which prank. Turn on notifications like you're activating a sneakoscope for new lore. That way, when the next deep dive drops, you're not arriving 3 days late, like you just apparated into class without your books. And share this with that one friend who still rants about Umbridge at 2 a.m. because they are absolutely going to want to see her paperwork era under Kingsley's Ministry and the other justice moments we've got coming. Look, nobody was surprised the wizarding world didn't just snap back to normal after Voldemort died. It stayed complicated, biased, magical, and a little broken. Which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly how this channel treats it too. We are not going back to normal either. So when we talk about after Voldemort, it's easy to picture courtrooms and Azkaban cells and Kingsley doing his very calm, very competent cleanup. But zoom out for a second. Remember how this story used to look? Green skulls hanging over houses. The dark mark turning the sky into a threat. Families grabbing kids, running, because somebody said you-know-who was back. Cut to 19 years later, and Harry's biggest stress is whether James is going to behave on the Hogwarts Express. Ginny is doing the emotional calculus of, do I embarrass my child in front of his friends, or do I let him live? Hermione is worrying about house elf legislation and house points. The war that literally shattered the wizarding world has become background radiation to arguments about homework and which cousin stole whose broom. Look, nobody was surprised that peace ended up looking kind of boring. That's the point. Every quiet morning at the Burrow, where Molly's yelling about toast instead of murder, that is a tiny victory over everything the Death Eaters wanted. Every boring ministry meeting where Harry has to sit through a 3-hour debate on cauldron bottom thickness instead of hunting Horcruxes is the universe saying, you get to be annoyed by this now. You survived. And Neville, the boy who used to lose his toad and his self-esteem on the same day, shuffling into class late, now trudges into a greenhouse to teach herbology. Kids complain about homework. Someone kills a cactus. He sighs, adjusts his cardigan, and goes home to Hannah at the Leaky Cauldron. That ordinary, mildly chaotic, deeply unglamorous life. That is a win. Every single lesson he teaches is one more year that the Carrows are not teaching dark arts. Let's start with the emotional bill they all had to pay. They earned this peace, not in some shiny, cinematic way, but through funerals, testimonies, rebuilding, and a decade of paperwork under Kingsley's ministry that we never see on the page. Harry giving evidence at trials. Andromeda raising Teddy. George opening the shop every morning while the empty space beside him is louder than any howler. This is what, after the war, actually looks like when the credits don't roll. So if you're wondering how to rewatch now, try this. Every time a Death Eater storms into a scene, remember that their choices echo for decades. Lucius groveling in the Great Hall isn't just a meme. It's the moment his family line swerves away from Azkaban and toward a quiet, awkward, semi-redemption arc that ends with Draco sending his kid to Hogwarts instead of to war. Yeah, take a moment. For now, let's celebrate the soft ending. The Dark Lord is gone. His followers are scattered, imprisoned, or hiding in houses that feel a little too big for them. The scars are still there, but the wizarding world, for tonight, gets to sleep. Trains still leave from platform 9 3/4. Owls still find their windows. And somewhere, under a sky with no dark mark, a child turns out the light and dreams of magic that isn't afraid anymore. So before we blow out the candles on this story, I want you to do one last bit of magic. Not wand waving, not Latin shouting, just imagination. Pick one quiet moment in the post-war wizarding world and freeze it, like your own personal pensive memory. It could be a former Death Eater in a too big, too quiet house, making tea at 2 a.m. because sleep still feels like a luxury they didn't earn. A chipped mug, a trembling hand, a dark mark that finally stopped burning but never stopped existing. Or maybe it's a war orphan at the kitchen table, parchment everywhere, doing boring, regular homework. Not defense essays about unforgivable curses, just herbology diagrams, arithmancy problems, The kind of homework you complain about while secretly being relieved that your biggest problem is fractions and not, Voldemort. If you're wondering what the world Harry fought for actually looks like, it's probably that. Not the duels, the dishes. The kid yelling, "Mum, where's my wand polish?" from the stairs. The neighbor who still flinches at loud noises while Kingsley, exhausted, signs yet another deeply boring regulation about flu network safety. The kind of bill that would put a dragon to sleep. Which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly the point. History isn't just dark lords and prophecies and legendary battles. It's who cleans up the Great Hall after the last victory feast. Who tucks the kids in when the nightmares hit at 3 a.m. Who shows up to fix the wards on a house that used to belong to a Death Eater and now belongs to a family that just wants a garden and a quiet life. So here's your mission before Lights Out. Pick that one scene. Maybe it's Draco walking Scorpius to the Hogwarts Express, trying a little too hard to be calm. Maybe it's Andromeda pouring herself tea while Teddy zooms around on a toy broom. Maybe it's Kingsley pausing over a file marked Azkaban Reform, rubbing his eyes, and signing anyway. Hold on to it. That's your epilogue. Your own tiny corner of the wizarding world where the camera doesn't go. You can drop it in the comments so we can all cry and scream together, or you can keep it as a private headcanon you visit when you're not ready to leave this world yet. And if you're still wide awake, for now, let's celebrate the fact that the story doesn't actually stop here. You can click into the next video and treat it like the next chapter. Keep wandering the castle corridors with us a little longer. Or you can close the laptop, turn out the light, and let the wizarding world go quiet for tonight. Both are allowed. Nobody's taking house points, because the Death Eaters, their endings are written. Azkaban cells, lonely manors, quiet cups of tea. The war is over. The nightmares are history. What comes next in this world, more kindness, more chaos, more curiosity, is up to people like us, telling stories in the dark. Yeah, take a moment, then choose your next chapter.